They fired him in front of his 8-year-old son. Not quietly, not with dignity. In a boardroom full of 50 people, engineers, executives, and investors, while a billion-dollar company burned around them, Isabel Hart pointed at Nathan Reed and told him to get out. The room went dead silent. Nathan didn't cry, didn't argue. He took his son's hand, picked up his badge from the table where he'd just laid it down, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped him. But as they left, as that little boy glanced one last time at the screen full of cascading code, something clicked behind those quiet 8-year-old eyes that would change everything. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 6:47, and Nathan Reed was already awake. He'd been lying on his back, staring at the ceiling for the better part of an hour, doing the thing he told himself he wouldn't do anymore, running numbers in his head. Rent was due in 9 days. Owen's fall registration for school needed a $200 deposit by Friday. The alternator on the Civic had been making a sound for 3 weeks that Nathan kept pretending wasn't happening because he didn't have the $400 to fix it. His left knee ached from sleeping badly on the edge of the mattress, the same edge he'd slept on for 2 years now, without moving to the center, because moving to the center felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. He reached over and silenced the alarm before it could wake Owen. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in East Portland that had seen better decades. The hallway carpet was the color of old mustard. One of the elevators worked about 60% of the time, but the building allowed dogs, which mattered when they'd moved in, back when they still had Remy, the golden retriever his wife Claire had adopted 3 weeks before she got sick. Remy had died 8 months after Claire. Nathan sometimes thought the dog had simply decided there was no point. He got up quietly, padded to the kitchen in socked feet, and started the coffee. The apartment had a particular quality in the early morning. Before Owen woke up, before the sounds from the street outside worked their way through the windows, where it could feel almost peaceful. Nathan had learned to exist inside those minutes, to make coffee and not think, to look out the window at the flat gray Portland sky and just breathe. On the kitchen table, pushed to one side, sat a framed photo. Him, Claire, and Owen at the Oregon coast. Owen, maybe 4 years old, soaking wet from a wave he hadn't seen coming, laughing so hard he'd fallen down. Claire's arm was around Nathan's waist, her chin tilted up, looking at him instead of the camera. He didn't look at the photo. He looked at the coffee maker. At 7:15, he heard the creak of Owen's door, the shuffle of small feet across the hallway. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a gray Portland Trailblazers t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big and a pair of sweatpants that had a hole in the left knee. His hair, dark like Claire's, was pressed flat on one side and sticking up on the other. He blinked at Nathan with the particular expression of a child who has not yet made peace with the existence of morning. "Did you make the good eggs?" Owen asked. "I haven't made any eggs yet." "Can you make the good eggs?" "I'm making eggs right now." Nathan opened the fridge. "Why are you up this early?" "Mrs. Calloway said we're doing the state capitals quiz today, and I kept dreaming about getting them wrong." Owen climbed onto the kitchen stool and propped his elbows on the counter. "What's the capital of Montana?" "Helena." "I knew that one." He paused. "What about Wyoming?" "Cheyenne." "I knew that one too. I just wanted to make sure." He watched Nathan crack eggs into the pan. "Dad?" "Yeah. Do you think Wyoming is a weird name for a state?" "I think Wyoming is a fine name for a state. It sounds like something you'd name a horse." Nathan almost smiled. He didn't quite make it, but it was close. Maybe someone did. Maybe there was a famous horse named Wyoming and the state was named after the horse. Owen considered this with genuine seriousness. That would be cool, actually. They ate breakfast together. The good eggs, scrambled with a little cheddar and some diced bell pepper, the way Claire used to make them, though Nathan had never told Owen that was why he made them that way. Owen reviewed state capitals with a flashcard set he'd made himself, small index cards with careful handwriting. Nathan drank his coffee and listened and corrected him twice. Tallahassee, not Tampa. Sacramento, not San Francisco. And Owen frowned both times with the focused displeasure of someone who needed to be right. At 7:55, Nathan's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, expecting the work calendar reminder. He'd had a 9 a.m. systems review on his schedule for 2 days. It was a text from Sandra Kowalski, Owen's babysitter, a retired school librarian from the second floor who'd been watching Owen after school and on the occasional long workday since they'd moved in. "Nathan, I am so sorry. My daughter just called. She's in labor, early. I'm at the hospital now. I can't make it today. I feel terrible, call me." He read the text twice. Then he looked at Owen, who was quizzing himself on New England states and muttering Montpellier under his breath with deep personal suspicion. Nathan put the phones down, thought for a moment, picked it up again and scrolled through his contacts. His sister Dana lived in Seattle. Useless. His neighbor Mark had 2 kids of his own and worked night shifts. There was a backup sitter Owen's school had recommended, but Nathan had never actually used her and didn't feel comfortable dropping Owen with a stranger on 40 minutes' notice. He tried his coworker Jeff. Voicemail. He tried his friend Carla, who worked from home. No answer. He sat there for a moment in the kitchen, looking at his phone, and felt the specific low-grade panic of a single parent facing a logistical problem with no exits. It was a feeling he knew well by now. It never got easier. It just got more familiar, which was not the same thing. Owen looked up from his flashcards. He had a way of reading his father's face that had developed over the past 2 years. Quietly, without making it obvious, the way children learn to read weather. "Is something wrong?" "Mrs. Calloway can't come today." "Oh." Owen set down his cards. "Do I have to come to work with you?" Nathan looked at him. "Is that okay?" Owen thought about it with the careful consideration of someone weighing real variables. "Is there a vending machine?" "There are 2. "Okay," Owen said. "I'll bring my book." Nathan Reed had worked at Veridian Cybersecurity for 4 years. He was, by any honest measure, one of the best systems engineers the company had. Not in the way that gets someone featured in industry press releases or invited to give keynote talks. Nathan wasn't built for that kind of visibility. He was good in the way that mattered more and got noticed less. He understood systems not just technically but intuitively, the way some people understand music or weather. He could look at a network architecture diagram the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, identifying stress points and structural weaknesses that weren't obviously broken yet but would be. He'd been recruited out of a smaller firm 4 years ago by the previous CTO, a methodical man named Gerald Watts, who retired 18 months back. Since then, Veridian had gone through significant changes. Isabel Hart had arrived 14 months ago. At 30 years old, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history, installed by the board after 2 quarters of stagnant growth and a failed product launch that had cost them a contract worth $30 million. She had a degree from MIT, an MBA from Wharton, and a track record at a Boston-based firm where she'd restructured a failing division and turned it profitable in 11 months. The board loved her. The business press loved her. Forbes had run a piece with a headline about her that Nathan had seen framed in the lobby and had made him vaguely uncomfortable, the way a too-polished shoe makes you nervous about the ground you're about to walk on. He didn't dislike Isabel Hart. He didn't know her well enough to dislike her. She operated several floors above him, in the world of investor calls and strategic partnerships and quarterly projections, and their interactions had been limited to a handful of all-hands meetings where she spoke and he listened, and one brief hallway conversation about a security audit report he'd filed 6 months ago. She'd been sharp in that conversation, faster than he expected, but there had been something clipped about her, something that didn't quite come to rest when she was talking to him, like she was already thinking about the next thing before the current thing was finished. He'd written it off as being busy. She was busy. Everyone in that building was busy. He didn't know, on that Tuesday morning when he buckled Owen into the backseat of the Civic and pulled out of the parking garage, that before the day was over, she would fire him. The first sign that something was wrong came before Nathan even reached the building. He was stopped at a light on Morrison Street when his work phone, the company issued one, separate from his personal, started ringing. It was Priya Mehta, his team lead, calling at 8:23 in the morning, which she had never done before. Priya was meticulous about boundaries. She didn't call before 9. "Where are you?" she said when he answered. No greeting, no preamble. 2 minutes out. There was a thing with the babysitter. Nathan. Her voice was tight in a way he'd never heard from her. "You need to get here now. We have a full-scale incident. The Meridian files. What happened?" We think we're under attack. Active intrusion. The whole system's responding wrong. She paused. Everyone's being pulled in. Isabel's already here. It's not even 9. She got called in at 6. Nathan, move. He clicked off. In the back seat, Owen had looked up from his book. He'd heard enough. Is it bad? Owen asked. I don't know yet. Nathan pulled through the intersection. Probably. Is it like the thing last year with the firewall? Nathan glanced in the rearview mirror. Owen was watching him with that calm attentiveness, that strange, quiet way of paying attention that sometimes made Nathan feel like he was the child and Owen was the adult. How do you know about the firewall thing? You were on your laptop at the kitchen table for like 6 hours, and you kept saying, come on, really quietly to yourself. I need to stop working in the kitchen. Nathan turned into the Viridian parking structure. This is probably bigger than the firewall thing. Oh, Owen said. And then, after a beat, I brought my chapter book and my puzzle book, so I'm fine. The Viridian building on the 14th floor was running at a frequency Nathan had never felt before. He knew the energy of a normal crisis, the controlled urgency of an incident that was bad but manageable, where people moved quickly but still stopped to think. This was different. This was the energy of something that had already gotten away from the people who were supposed to be controlling it, and everyone knew it, and nobody was saying it out loud because saying it out loud would mean dealing with what it meant. People moved through the hallways with the tight, electric energy of barely controlled panic. 2 engineers Nathan didn't recognize were having a heated, low-voiced argument outside the server room. Someone had propped open the door to the main operations center, and Nathan could see the wall of monitors from the hallway. Every one of them covered in data that was moving too fast, throwing alerts in red and amber that pulsed like a warning light. He put his hand on Owen's shoulder and pulled him a little closer as they walked. Keep close to me, Nathan said. Owen didn't say anything. He was looking at everything. Priya met them at the entrance to the engineering wing. She was a small, precise woman with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her head and a habit of tapping her pen against her clipboard when she was thinking hard. The pen was moving fast. She looked at Owen and then at Nathan, and her expression did something complicated. You brought... I didn't know you were bringing... Babysitter fell through. I tried everyone. I'm sorry, Priya. No. She shook her head. No, it's fine. It's fine. We'll figure something out. She looked at Owen again. Hi. Hi, Owen said. I have a puzzle book. That's great. She looked back at Nathan. Her voice dropped. Okay, here's where we are. Sometime overnight, we started getting unusual access patterns in the Meridian partition. That's the system architecture for the Holbrook merger files, all the due diligence documentation, the financial models, everything. By 6 this morning, it was clear someone was inside the system, not just poking at the perimeter. Inside, moving through the architecture like they knew it. Nathan felt the cold settle in his chest. The merger closes Friday. 3 days. Yes. If the Holbrook people find out, they already called. Isabel's on damage control. Priya glanced down the hallway. The board is on a call right now. There's talk of pulling the merger entirely if we can't demonstrate the breach is contained and the data is clean. The merger was worth $1.3 billion. Nathan knew the number because it had been mentioned in every all-hands for the past 8 months, always with the particular gravity of a number that represented the difference between what a company was and what it could become. What's the current vector? Nathan said. That's the problem. We don't know. The team's been working the standard playbook, isolate, patch, reroute, and the attack keeps coming back. Every time we block one point of entry, it shifts. It's like... Priya paused and the pen stopped tapping. It's like it knows what we're doing. A bad feeling moved through Nathan. Not panic. He'd learned to keep panic at bay, or at least to move alongside it rather than inside it. But something specific, a pattern recognition instinct that had served him well, was starting to activate. Where's the recovery protocol running? We initialized Sentinel at 6:45 this morning. Nathan stopped walking. Priya looked at him. What? Sentinel, the automated recovery system. Yes. Who authorized that? Marcus did, on Isabel's direction. It's protocol. It's protocol for standard breaches. Nathan started walking again, faster. Priya, I need to see the full system log, right now. Nathan, the all hands is in 15 minutes. I know, I need to see the log first. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to trust an instinct they can't fully articulate. Then she nodded. Conference room B. I'll get you access. But Nathan, yeah. The meeting is in the main boardroom. Isabel will be there, and she's... Priya chose her next word carefully. She's not in a patient place right now. Understood. He steered Owen toward conference room B, where a workstation was already running. Owen climbed onto a chair beside Nathan and pulled out his puzzle book and opened it to somewhere in the middle, and Nathan didn't have time to process the gratitude he felt for his son's ability to exist quietly in a room while his father needed to think. He pulled up the system logs. He started reading. The boardroom on the 14th floor was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides looked out over the Portland skyline, and on clear days, the distant whiteness of Mount Hood. The table was long and dark and expensive. The chairs were the kind that communicated, just by the quality of their leather, that the people sitting in them made decisions that mattered. Nathan had been in this room 3 times before. Twice for company-wide presentations, once for a security review briefing. He walked in at 3 minutes after 9, holding Owen's hand. He saw Isabel Hart before she saw him. She was standing at the far end of the table, near the wall of monitors that had been set up for the crisis response. 4 large screens running live system data, one showing a video feed of the operations center, one showing what looked like a conversation thread with the board's legal team. She was in a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back, and she was talking quietly but intensely with a man Nathan recognized as Marcus Cho, the head of IT infrastructure. She looked, Nathan thought, like someone in the process of holding a very large thing together through sheer force of will. There were approximately 40 people in the room, senior engineers, department heads, 2 members of the board, 3 faces Nathan didn't recognize who had the polished, wary look of outside legal counsel. The room was loud with the overlapping urgency of a dozen concurrent conversations. Then Owen walked in. The silence didn't fall all at once. It fell in a wave, rolling from the door inward as people noticed. First the people near the entrance, then the ones further in, until the room was quiet enough that Nathan could hear the soft hum of the monitors. Everyone was looking at them. Isabel turned. Her eyes moved from Nathan to Owen and back to Nathan. Her expression didn't change immediately. It went through something, a single second of recalibration, and then settled into something that was harder and more controlled. Mr. Reed. Her voice was flat and precise, the kind of voice that had learned to carry rooms. I wasn't aware we'd opened a Bring Your Child to Work emergency session. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. Nathan felt the heat move up the back of his neck. My childcare fell through this morning. I apologize for the disruption, but Your childcare. She said it the way someone repeats a thing back when they want the speaker to hear how it sounds. There is a $1 billion data breach currently dismantling this company's most critical deal. Our merger partner is 40 minutes away from walking. We have the board on the line, legal counsel in this room, and I have pulled in every senior engineer we have. And you have walked into our crisis response meeting with a child. The room was very, very quiet. He'll stay out of the way, Nathan said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He has a book. He'll sit in the corner. Ms. Hart, I've been looking at the system logs this morning, and I think I may have found... Mr. Reed. She cut him off. Not angrily, worse than angry, deliberately, like a door closing. I don't know what's in the logs or what you think you found, and right now I genuinely don't have the bandwidth to find out, because what I have in front of me is a very senior engineer who has chosen today, of all days, to demonstrate that he can't manage his professional obligations. That's not... Nathan stopped, started again. That's not what this is. I have to think about this room, Isabel said. I have to think about what the board sees, what legal sees, what our partners see when they eventually review how we handled this crisis. And what they see right now is a child in a boardroom. She paused. The badge, please. The room was so quiet Nathan could hear Owen's breathing beside him. Ms. Hart, your badge, Mr. Reed, and your company phone. You can arrange to collect your personal items from HR. Nathan stood very still for a moment. He was aware of every person in the room. He was aware of the monitors flickering with data. He was aware of Owen's hand in his. That Owen had not moved, had not made a sound, that his son was standing very still in the way that children stand still when they are working very hard to be invisible, because the adult world around them is doing something frightening. He did not beg. He had decided in the fraction of a second before he answered that he would not do that. Not here. Not in front of all these people, and not, most importantly, in front of Owen. He unclipped the badge from his jacket. He laid it on the table in front of him. He took the company phone from his pocket and set it beside the badge. For the record, Nathan said quietly, I think I know why the attack keeps adapting, and I think Sentinel is making it worse. He looked at Isabel. She held his gaze without flinching. I hope I'm wrong. He picked up Owen's hand. They walked out. Owen didn't say anything in the elevator. He didn't say anything in the parking garage, or during the 3 minutes it took Nathan to drive 6 blocks, or when Nathan pulled into the small lot behind Marta's, a diner he'd eaten at a dozen times alone and twice with Owen on weekend mornings. He said something when they were sitting in a booth by the window after the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Diane, whose name tag was slightly crooked, had poured Nathan a coffee and put a hot chocolate in front of Owen without being asked. Are you going to be okay? Owen said. Nathan looked at his coffee. Yeah. Is that true, or are you just saying that? Nathan looked up. Owen was watching him across the table with dark, steady eyes that were so much like Claire's, it sometimes physically hurt to look at them. I don't know yet, Nathan said. I think probably yes. Eventually. Owen turned his hot chocolate slowly in his hands. She was mean. She was in a bad situation, and she made a bad call. Nathan wrapped both hands around his mug. That's different from mean, though right now it doesn't feel very different. She didn't have to do it in front of everybody. Nathan didn't have an answer for that. No, she didn't. They sat with that for a minute. Through the window, Morrison Street moved with its regular Tuesday morning rhythm. People walking fast, cars running yellow lights, a delivery truck double parked outside the pharmacy across the street. The world was doing its regular things, indifferent to the fact that Nathan Reed was currently unemployed and uncertain, for the first time since Owen was born, about the near-term shape of their lives. He pulled out his personal phone and started making a list. It was what he did when things fell apart. Made lists, because lists were something you could act on, and acting on things was better than staring at the ceiling. Expenses this month, emergency fund, 6 weeks, resume update. LinkedIn. Call Dana? No. Jeff Mahar at Cascade Systems. Reach out. He stopped. Across the table, Owen had pulled a cocktail napkin from the dispenser on the table. He was drawing on it. Nathan glanced over, half his mind still on the list, and registered that Owen was drawing something that looked like a diagram. He looked back at his phone, looked back at Owen. The diagram was precise. Owen wasn't an artistic kid. His drawings were usually blocky and approximate, the way most 8-year-olds drew. But this wasn't that kind of drawing. This was something deliberate. Lines connecting to boxes, numbers written small and careful at the intersections. What are you drawing? Nathan asked. Owen looked up. He had the expression he got when he'd been thinking about something for a while and wasn't sure if it was worth saying out loud. The screen in the room. Which screen? The big one. The one with all the lines running through it when you were talking to the lady. He tilted the napkin toward Nathan. I was watching it while you were talking. There was a pattern. I drew it. Nathan took the napkin. He looked at it. The thing about Owen was that he had always paid attention to Nathan's work in a way that was quiet and therefore easy to underestimate. Nathan worked from home most Tuesdays, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop while Owen did homework on the other side of the table. Owen had started, somewhere around age 6, asking occasional questions. Not demanding ones, just curious. What are those lines? What does that number mean? Why does it go red and then go back to green? Nathan had answered, not because he expected Owen to understand, but because ignoring the questions of an 8-year-old felt wrong, and because there was something that kept Owen interested in ways that most adults' questions didn't. Owen never asked, what does this do in the abstract? He always asked, why does it do this? Why does it go red? Why is this number different from that number? Why does the line stop here? He'd explain things to Owen the way you explain things to someone who isn't an expert but is paying full attention, which meant simplifying but not dumbing down. He hadn't realized how much had accumulated. He looked at the napkin. His breath stopped. What Owen had drawn was a rough schematic of the system architecture display from the boardroom. Rough, the way a sketch is rough, not inaccurate. The main lines were approximately right. The junction points were approximately right. And at the center of the diagram, circled in pencil, was a sequence. A loop. A pattern Nathan had seen on the screen this morning and had passed over because he'd been distracted, because Owen had been beside him, because he'd been processing a dozen things at once. He looked at the circled pattern. Something went very cold and very quiet inside him. "Owen," he said carefully, "this pattern you circled. Why did you circle it?" Owen picked up the napkin and looked at it. "Because it was different. It ran twice." He traced it with a finger. "See, it runs through here, and then later it comes back and runs again. But the second time it was going the other direction." Nathan stared at his son. "It was going the other direction," he repeated. "Yeah, like—" Owen paused, thinking of how to explain it. "Like if you walked through a door and then someone turned the door around and you walked through it again, but now you're on the wrong side." The cold in Nathan's chest expanded. He thought about what Priya had told him. Every time we block one point of entry, it shifts. He thought about what he'd started to piece together in Conference Room B before he'd run out of time. He thought about Sentinel, the automated recovery system, and the specific way it worked. The way it had been designed to respond to breaches by cycling through the system architecture and reinforcing weak points. If the intrusion was using the architecture against itself, if the attack had been designed to exploit Sentinel specifically, he thought, the recovery system is reopening the door. Every time the engineers activated Sentinel to fight the breach, Sentinel was scanning the architecture for vulnerabilities and reinforcing them. But if the attacker had planted something in the scan protocol itself, something that looked like a patch but functioned as a relay, then every time Sentinel ran its cycle, it wasn't closing doors. It was creating new ones. And every time the engineers hit the recovery protocol, they were handing the attacker a new entry point. It's like it knows what we're doing. It did. Because they were telling it. Nathan set the napkin down. He picked up his coffee. His hand was not entirely steady. "Dad?" Owen was watching him. "You did something," Nathan said. He didn't know exactly how to finish the sentence. "Did I do something bad?" "No." Nathan looked at his son. "No, you did something—" He stopped, picked up the napkin again, looked at the circled pattern. He thought about the job he no longer had. He thought about the building 6 blocks away where a billion-dollar company was currently burning, while the people inside it worked the wrong solution with increasing desperation. He thought about Isabel Hart standing at the end of that boardroom table with the particular expression of someone who is holding something together by will alone and knew, somewhere behind the controlled exterior, that it might not be enough. He thought about what it would mean to walk away. He thought about Owen sitting across the table from him with hot chocolate and a napkin and 8 years of quiet attentiveness, and the specific miracle of what that attentiveness had just produced. He put the napkin in his jacket pocket. He put a 20 on the table for Diane. He looked at Owen. "How do you feel about going back?" Owen considered. "Will she be mean again?" "Maybe." "But you found something?" "We found something." Owen looked at him steadily. He reached across the table and touched the pocket where Nathan had put the napkin, as if confirming it was still there. Then he slid out of the booth. "Okay," he said. "But can I finish my hot chocolate first?" Nathan almost laughed. He sat back down. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, finish your hot chocolate." He called Priya from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was waiting for it, which meant she'd been thinking about him. He found that oddly steadying. "Where are you?" she said. "Marta's. On Morrison." "Are you—" She stopped, started again. "Are you okay?" "I need 5 minutes with the senior team," Nathan said. "Not with Isabel. With Marcus and whoever is actively working the recovery. Can you make that happen?" A pause. He could hear the background noise of the operations floor. Keyboards, voices, the persistent chime of system alerts. "Nathan, she fired you." "I know." "You don't have clearance anymore." "Priya." He kept his voice level. "I know what Sentinel is doing to the system. I know why the attack keeps coming back. And I know it because of something my 8-year-old son noticed watching a screen for 30 seconds while I was getting my badge taken away. He paused. 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, you've lost 5 minutes. If I'm right, he didn't finish the sentence. Another pause. Longer. I'm going to owe you so much therapy money, Priya said. I'll bill you. Give me 10 minutes. She called back in 7. Come to the side entrance, she said. I'm bringing you in through infrastructure. In the back seat, Owen had finished his hot chocolate, brought his cup inside because he'd been raised that way, and retrieved his chapter book. He was reading, chin propped on his fist, apparently unconcerned about the fact that they were about to walk back into the building that had expelled them 90 minutes earlier. We're going back, Nathan said. I know. Owen turned a page. I heard. It might be uncomfortable. It was already uncomfortable. Another page. I'm ready when you are. Nathan sat there for a moment, looking at his son in the rearview mirror. He thought about the word lucky and how inadequate it was for what he meant. He thought about how love was sometimes the quietest and most structural thing in a life, the thing that ran through the architecture holding everything else in place, invisible until you needed it, foundational the whole time. He started the car. They came in through the loading dock entrance on the building's north side, where Priya was waiting with a visitor badge that technically wasn't supposed to exist for a person who'd been let go 3 hours ago. She didn't mention the badge's unofficial status. Nathan didn't ask. She led them down a back corridor toward the infrastructure room, a smaller space adjacent to the main operations center, where Marcus Cho was currently stationed with 3 other senior engineers at a cluster of workstations. Marcus was 43, broad-shouldered, with the particular brand of focused exhaustion that came from having been working a serious problem since before dawn. He looked up when Nathan walked in. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, uncertainty, something that was either irritation or relief. Priya said you found something, Marcus said. It wasn't a greeting and it wasn't a question. It was the statement of a man who had been wrong enough times today that he had stopped being proud. My son found something, Nathan said. Marcus looked at Owen. Owen looked back at Marcus with the polite, attentive expression of someone at a meeting they've been invited to. He's 8, Marcus said. Yes. He found him. Marcus? Nathan reached into his jacket and laid the napkin on the desk. Look at this. Marcus looked at the napkin for approximately 3 seconds before his expression changed. He looked at Nathan. The Sentinel cycle, Nathan said. The Sentinel cycle, Marcus repeated. Every time you run the recovery protocol, the scan cycle hits the relay point. Nathan pointed to the circled sequence. If there's a planted hook in the scan architecture, sis, and I think there is, I think it's been there since the original intrusion. It might even be what enabled the original intrusion. Then every time Sentinel scans for vulnerabilities, it's activating the relay. It's reopening the door. The room was quiet. One of the other engineers, a young woman named Sheila, who Nathan had worked with twice before, was already typing. Her fingers were moving fast, and she had the focused intensity of someone for whom the fog had just cleared. If that's right, she said, not looking up, if there's a hook in the scan protocol, then stopping the attack means stopping Sentinel, Nathan said. First, before you do anything else, the recovery protocol is the weapon, Sheila typed. The monitors above her workstation were running the live system data, the same cascade of alerts and indicators that had been burning all morning. Nathan watched the screens and felt the pattern resolving behind his eyes, the way it sometimes did when the problem stopped being abstract and became structural. This was the thing about being good at what he did. Not intelligence, exactly, more like a kind of spatial intuition about systems, the ability to see the shape of the problem before seeing every detail of the problem. He looked at Owen. Owen was standing slightly to the side, out of the way, watching the monitors with that quiet, steady look. He'd put his book in his backpack. He was paying attention in his particular way, not obviously, not obtrusively, just fully present. Marcus picked up a phone and called the operations center. Stop the Sentinel cycle, he said. Right now. Kill the recovery protocol. Yes, I know. Do it anyway. There was a pause. On the monitors, something changed. The particular rhythm of the alerts. The pulsing, adaptive frequency that had been running all morning, that quality of it knows what we're doing, shifted, stuttered, stopped. The room held its breath. "Okay," Sheila said softly. "Okay, there it is." Her voice was different, not excited exactly, but tight and focused in the way voices get when something important has just become visible. "There's the hook. It's in the scan subroutine. It's been using every recovery cycle to reroute. Every single one." Marcus put down the phone. He looked at Nathan. He looked at the napkin on the desk, at the rough sketch drawn from memory by an 8-year-old on a piece of paper from a diner 6 blocks away. "We need Isabel," Marcus said quietly. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. "I understand." "Nathan!" "I know. Get her. We have work to do." Marcus nodded. He stepped out. And Nathan Reed sat down at a workstation in the infrastructure room of a company that had fired him that morning, with his son standing quietly beside him, and started doing the work that needed to be done. Because the door had been identified, and now it needed to be closed. He reached over without looking and briefly squeezed Owen's shoulder. Owen put his hand over his father's for a second. Just a second. Then they both went back to the screen. The hook was real. Sheila found it 11 minutes after Marcus killed the Sentinel cycle. A fragment of malicious code buried inside the scan subroutine like a splinter, driven so deep into wood that the surface had healed over it. It was elegant in the way that genuinely dangerous things sometimes are. Whoever had designed it understood Sentinel's architecture at a level that suggested either inside knowledge or a level of external reconnaissance that should have been impossible. The hook was passive on its own. It did nothing when the system was idle. It only activated when Sentinel ran its recovery cycle. And when it did, it used Sentinel's own scanning function as a relay, bouncing access credentials through a series of obfuscated pathways that redirected data outward while looking to every surface-level monitor like normal recovery traffic. The attack hadn't been breaking through Viridian's defenses. It had been riding them. Every time the engineers had run the recovery protocol, and they'd run it 14 times since 6 that morning, they'd handed the attacker 14 fresh windows of access, each one lasting approximately 3 minutes, each one quietly siphoning data from the Meridian partition while the team stared at the alert screens and tried to understand why the breach kept reappearing. Sheila sat back in her chair and said, "I need a minute," in the voice of someone who needed considerably more than a minute but wasn't going to take it. The engineer beside her, a quiet man named David Park, who Nathan had worked alongside on 2 previous projects and respected for the specific quality of never saying anything unless he was sure of it, pulled up the data transfer logs and studied them without speaking for almost 2 minutes. Then he said, 41 gigabytes. The room absorbed that number. "Is it clean?" Marcus asked. "We won't know until we audit the full log." David didn't look away from his screen. But the transfer pathway was narrow. It was targeting the financial models and the due diligence files, the merger documentation. "How much of that is actually sensitive?" "All of it is sensitive," Nathan said. He was 2 workstations down, running his own analysis of the hook's architecture, looking for secondary components. The question is whether it's been transmitted to a third party or just staged somewhere for later retrieval. Those are different problems. Marcus nodded. He had the slightly hollow look of a man who has been awake since 4 in the morning, dealing with a crisis that turned out to be worse than the crisis he thought he was dealing with. He was processing things in sequence, which Nathan recognized as a good sign. It meant he was still thinking structurally rather than reactively. "If it's staged," Marcus said, "we still have a window." "Possibly." Nathan paused over his screen. "There's a secondary component here. Give me a few minutes." Marcus moved to the door and stood there with his phone, making calls in a low voice. Nathan could hear fragments, Board, Legal, Holbrook, and the particular clipped tone of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have to deliver while simultaneously managing the other person's reaction. Owen had moved to a chair along the wall. He'd taken his chapter book back out but wasn't reading it. It was open in his lap, but his eyes were on the monitors, moving between screens with the steady, unhurried attention that had, apparently, cataloged a pattern no one else in this building had caught. Nathan was aware of him the way he was always aware of Owen in a room. A low-level constant tracking, the parental equivalent of a background process. Priya appeared in the doorway, looked at Marcus, then at Nathan. She raised her eyebrows in a silent question. Nathan gave a small nod. She closed her eyes briefly in what was either relief or exhaustion, and then composed herself back into her regular expression. "Isabel's coming," Marcus said, hanging up. Nathan kept his eyes on his screen. "She wanted to know if you're still here," Marcus added. There was something careful in the way he said it. "Tell her I'm still here," Nathan said. "Tell her we can deal with the other stuff later. Right now, I need her team to let me work." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "She's the one who called you back in." That landed differently than Nathan expected. He stopped typing. "What?" "After you left. About 40 minutes after." Marcus crossed his arms. "She called Priya, asked where you were, said to bring you back if you were willing." He paused. "Priya said you'd already called." Nathan sat with that for a second. He wasn't sure what to do with it, so he filed it and went back to the screen. There would be time to deal with what it meant later, or there wouldn't, but either way, it wasn't what mattered right now. "The secondary component is a dormancy trigger," he said. "If the primary hook gets isolated, this one activates. It's a backup. Different pathway, different relay structure. I need to map it before we move to containment, or we'll just start this whole thing over again." David leaned over to look. "That's not in the scan subroutine." "No, it's in the authentication layer." Nathan traced the pathway on screen with one finger without touching the monitor. "It's been sitting there dormant, waiting. If we'd run standard containment without finding this, we would have sealed the front door and left the window open." How did you find that so fast?" Sheila asked. Nathan glanced toward Owen. Sheila followed his gaze. Owen looked up from his book with the slightly surprised expression of someone who hadn't expected to be looked at. "I've been thinking about the system for a while," Nathan said. "It helps to have a fresh set of eyes that aren't tired and aren't scared." Owen looked down at his book again. His ears had gone slightly red, which was what happened to him when he was embarrassed by a compliment but didn't want to show it. Nathan had been noticing that particular ear color since Owen was 5. Marcus said, "I'm going to need both of you to walk Isabel through this." Nathan said, "Fine." Nobody said anything else. They worked. The infrastructure room had a quality in the next hour that Nathan had experienced before in crisis situations but never quite gotten used to. A kind of focused collective energy that was almost physical, like pressure, like the air changing before weather. People stopped having individual agendas. The ambient competitiveness and hierarchy that ran through every workplace like background radiation simply switched off because there wasn't bandwidth for it, and because the problem was real enough and immediate enough that it eclipsed everything else. Sheila and David and 2 other engineers whose names Nathan didn't know worked alongside him with the specific mutual trust of people who were each doing something genuinely difficult and had decided to believe the person next to them was also capable. It was, Nathan thought, what the job was supposed to feel like, before the politics and the performance reviews and the quarterly priorities. At 10:47, the door opened and Isabel Hart walked in. She wasn't what Nathan expected, which surprised him because he thought he knew what to expect. He expected the controlled exterior from the boardroom, the flat precision, the CEO managing a disaster performance. She came in wearing that charcoal blazer, but something about it looked different now. Less armored somehow. There was a quality of tiredness around her eyes that the bright fluorescent light of the infrastructure room made impossible to hide. She'd been awake since before 6, and she'd spent those hours carrying something heavy. She stopped when she saw Nathan. He stopped when she came in. The room developed that particular stillness that happens when 2 people with unresolved business are suddenly in the same physical space, and everyone else becomes aware of it simultaneously. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Ms. Hart." A beat. She looked at Owen, sitting along the wall with his book. Something moved through her expression. There and gone, too fast to name precisely. She looked back at Nathan. "Marcus told me what you found." She kept her voice professional, but there was an edge to it that wasn't anger, something more like controlled uncertainty, which on her face looked unfamiliar, like a feature she didn't use much. "We found it," Nathan said. He gestured toward the room. "This team. I just brought a piece they were missing. Marcus said your son. Marcus briefed you. You know what happened." Nathan turned back to his screen. "Right now the secondary component is the priority. I've mapped the pathway, but I need another 20 minutes to verify the full architecture before we can move to containment, if that's acceptable. Isabel stood in the doorway for a moment. Nathan was aware of her without looking at her. It's acceptable, she said. She came into the room. She pulled a chair to a workstation and sat down and asked David to walk her through the current status. She didn't insert herself. She didn't take over. She listened and asked specific technical questions that revealed she understood more about the system architecture than Nathan had given her credit for. He registered that, filed it alongside the information that she had called Priya to bring him back. The 20 minutes he'd estimated turned into 35, because the secondary component had a tertiary branch that David found tucked inside a network authentication certificate that had been issued 8 months ago and had looked, until now, completely routine. 3 components, nested like Russian dolls inside the system that was supposed to protect everything. This isn't a smash and grab, Sheila said when they'd mapped all 3. This is long game. This was planned months ago. The merger timeline was public, Isabel said quietly. She was looking at the screen map of the intrusion architecture. We announced the Holbrook partnership 8 months ago, she paused. So was the certificate. The room absorbed that. Nobody said out loud what everyone was thinking, that someone had been planning this since the beginning. That the timing of the merger announcement and the timing of the planted certificate were not a coincidence. That the attack on a specific Friday close date was not a coincidence. That whoever had done this had done it with patience and precision and a detailed understanding of Viridian's internal systems that narrowed the suspect pool considerably. Nathan didn't say it. It wasn't his problem to say it. That was for legal and for the forensic team that would spend the next several weeks pulling this apart. His problem, right now, was containment. We need to take the authentication layer fully offline, he said. Controlled shutdown, not an emergency kill. If we do an emergency kill with the dormancy trigger active, we might trip it. We need to isolate each component sequentially. He looked at David. Can you write the isolation sequence? Already started, David said. Sheila, I need you to monitor the data transfer logs in real time during the sequence. If the dormancy trigger activates despite the controlled shutdown, we'll see it in the transfer traffic before it completes a relay. 2-second response window. I'll be watching, Sheila said. Marcus, the board needs to know that we have a containment plan and that the merger files haven't been fully exfiltrated. We need at least an hour before Holbrook gets any updated briefing. The narrative matters almost as much as the technical fix right now. Marcus nodded and stepped out with his phone. Nathan became aware that Isabel had moved to stand slightly behind him and to his left. She was reading his screen. She didn't say anything. He kept working. After a moment, she said, quietly, so only he could hear, "You said Sentinel was making it worse. In the boardroom. Before She stopped. Yeah. You'd already figured out part of it. Part of it." He kept his eyes on the screen. Owen figured out the rest, or the piece that made the rest clear. Another pause. How? He was watching the monitors during the meeting. He noticed a pattern in the system display. Drew it on a napkin. Nathan paused over his keyboard. He's been watching me work at the kitchen table for 2 years, asks a lot of questions, pays attention. Isabel was quiet for a moment. How old is he? 8. He heard her exhale slowly, barely a sound. He didn't look at her. We'll talk later, she said. After. After, he agreed. She moved away. He worked. The isolation sequence took 42 minutes to complete. David ran it with the careful, methodical precision of a surgeon, each component isolated in sequence. The authentication layer brought down section by section in a controlled cascade that gave the dormancy trigger no clean moment to activate. Sheila watched the transfer logs with the focus of someone who has been given a 2-second window and intends to use every millisecond of it. The dormancy trigger never fired. At 12:23 in the afternoon, the last alert cleared from the operations center screens. Nathan watched it happen on the monitor above Sheila's workstation, the amber and red indicators cycling down one by one, the system status moving from critical through elevated through monitoring, and finally settling, cautiously, into something that read stable. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't feel like a movie version of victory. The screens just stopped screaming. Sheila put both palms flat on her desk and closed her eyes. David said, "Okay," in the particular flat tone of someone who has just done something very hard and needs approximately 36 hours of sleep before they can feel anything about it. Someone in the operations center, visible through the glass partition, started clapping. Then a few more people. It was ragged and uncertain at first, the way applause is when people aren't sure they're allowed to feel relieved yet. Nathan sat back in his chair. He became aware, in the slightly dazed way of someone returning from deep concentration to ordinary life, that his right shoulder ached from hunching, that he hadn't eaten anything since the good eggs at 7:15 that morning, and that his son had been sitting against the wall for the better part of 3 hours being extremely patient. He looked over at Owen. Owen was asleep. He was tilted against the wall at an angle that was going to be bad for his neck. His chapter book slid off his lap and lying open on the floor, and he was out, completely and categorically unconscious in the way that only children can be. No transition zone, just a clean drop into sleep. Nathan looked at his son for a moment. He thought about the napkin in his jacket pocket. He'd put it there at the diner, and he hadn't taken it out since, and it had been there through everything. The drive back, the loading dock entrance, 3 hours of concentrated technical work. A piece of diner napkin with a pencil diagram drawn from memory by an 8-year-old who had been watching the screens during the meeting where his father got fired. The room was settling around him, people talking quietly. Marcus back at his phone. Priya in the doorway, watching Nathan with an expression he recognized as a combination of relief and something that was probably going to become a story she told for years. Isabel was standing near the center of the room. She had a phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at Owen, asleep against the wall. Nathan got up and walked to his son. He picked up the book and set it gently on the chair beside him. He straightened Owen slightly so his neck wasn't at such a harsh angle. Owen stirred but didn't wake, just resettled, pressing his cheek against the wall, making a small sound that was somewhere between complaint and contentment. Nathan crouched beside him for a moment. Repeats. He wasn't given to sentimental gestures, not in front of people. He was a private man by nature, had become more so after Claire died, had built a life organized around efficiency and forward motion because those were the tools that had gotten him through the past 2 years, and he'd learned to rely on them. But he put his hand on the back of Owen's head, just briefly, just for a second. Then he stood up and turned around, and Isabel was 3 feet away, and he had not heard her cross the room. She had the look of someone who had organized a lot of things around themselves over many years and was currently in the process of recognizing that some of the organization might have been wrong. It wasn't a comfortable look, it was a real one. "Nathan," she said. "Not Mr. Reed." "Nathan." He waited. "I owe you an apology." She said it directly, without preamble, in the tone of someone who has decided to say a hard thing and is going to say it cleanly or not at all. "What I did this morning was wrong. The way I did it was worse. You deserved better, and I—" She paused. "I was managing the room instead of thinking. I was thinking about perception, and I stopped thinking about the person in front of me." She glanced at Owen. "And about what he was seeing." Nathan looked at her. Her gaze didn't waver, which he noted, not because it proved anything, but because it was harder than it looked, holding someone's eyes after you've hurt them and not looking for an easy out. "It was a bad call," he said. "It was. In front of everybody." "I know." She didn't make excuses for it. "I know." Nathan was quiet for a moment. In the background, Marcus was on the phone with what sounded like the Holbrook team, and his voice had gone from tightly controlled to something that sounded almost like cautious optimism. Sheila was compiling the incident report. David had found a granola bar from somewhere and was eating it at his workstation with the focused pleasure of a person who is extremely hungry and not pretending otherwise. "We still need to find who planted the hook," Nathan said. "That's going to take weeks of forensic work. The authentication certificate alone—" "I know." Isabel nodded. "Legal is already pulling in a forensic team, and the board authorized a full internal audit." She paused. "That's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people." "Yeah." A silence settled between them, not hostile, just unresolved. The kind of space that exists between what has happened and what hasn't been decided yet. "The merger," Nathan said. "Marcus is on with Holbrook's legal team right now. The fact that we identified and isolated the breach before full exfiltration, that matters. The fact that we did it in hours rather than days, that matters. Whether it's enough?" She exhaled. We'll know by end of day. Nathan nodded. He thought about the $1.3 billion. He thought about what it meant for the people in this building. Not abstractly, but concretely. Jobs, livelihoods, the specific ordinary financial reality of 500 people who showed up to work at this company every day. He thought about Priya's mortgage and David's kids and Sheila, who he knew was putting a sibling through college. He thought about his own bank account and the 9 days until rent and the noise the Civic's alternator was making. My job, he said. Isabel looked at him steadily. If you want it, that's your decision to make. I won't. She stopped, revised. I can't ask you to just come back like nothing happened. That's not how this works. What I can do is tell you that the offer is there and that it would come with the kind of title and compensation that should have been on the table for you a year ago. She paused. And with my word that this morning never happens again. That's worth whatever you think my word is worth. Nathan looked at her. He wasn't sure yet what her word was worth. He suspected it was worth more than he'd given her credit for before today, which was a recalibration he hadn't expected to be making. I need to think about it, he said. That's fair. And I need to pick up my son's registration deposit before Friday. Something moved across Isabel's face that was almost a smile. HR can process that paperwork by tomorrow morning. Nathan looked over at Owen, still asleep against the wall. The afternoon light through the small, high window of the infrastructure room was falling across the floor near his sneakers. His mouth was slightly open. He had a crease from the wall on his cheek. Nathan thought about the day. About the alarm at 6:47 and the good eggs in Owen's flashcards. About Sandra Kowalski's text and the parking garage and the boardroom and the diner. About a napkin with a pencil diagram and the specific, terrible, tilting moment when he'd understood what it meant. He thought about Claire. Not in the way he usually thought about her, the weight of it, the ongoing presence of her absence, but differently, more like a recognition. That she had known somehow what she was giving him, that the particular child she had given him was exactly right for a life that had turned out to be exactly this hard. He didn't say any of that. He filed it. I'll call you tomorrow, Nathan told Isabel. She nodded. I'll be in the office. Nathan crossed to Owen. He crouched down and put his hand on his son's shoulder and shook gently. Owen opened his eyes. They were unfocused for a moment, the classic 4-second lag of a child going from deep sleep to the world. Then they sharpened. He looked at Nathan, then at the room, then at the screens, which were calm and quiet and no longer throwing red. Did you fix it? Owen asked. His voice was rough with sleep. We fixed it. Owen looked at the screens for another moment. He was processing, in his particular way, doing the internal calculation that Nathan had watched him do his whole short life, taking in what was in front of him and placing it against what he'd understood before and deciding what to make of the difference. Did the pattern thing work? Owen asked. The pattern thing worked. Owen nodded slowly. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'm hungry. I know. We'll get food. Can we get the sandwiches from the place on 5th? We can get sandwiches from wherever you want. Owen stood up, slightly unsteady in the way of fresh waking, and retrieved his chapter book from the chair. He put it in his backpack. He looked at Isabel, who was still standing near them. She was looking at him with an expression that Owen apparently found normal enough to accept, a child's direct, unguarded assessment, followed by the acceptance of whatever he found there. Hi, Owen said to her. Hi, Isabel said. Her voice was different than it had been in the boardroom, quieter. I'm sorry about this morning. Owen considered that. You were having a bad day. I was. My teacher says that's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. He thought about it. I think those are different. Isabel looked at him for a moment. They are, she said. They really are. Owen hitched his backpack up on his shoulder and looked at Nathan. Ready? Ready. They walked out of the infrastructure room together, back down the rear corridor, past the loading dock entrance, out into the early afternoon. The sky outside was the same flat Portland gray it had been at 7 that morning. The street sounds were ordinary. The city was doing its regular Tuesday things with complete indifference to what had happened inside that building, which was how cities worked and was, Nathan thought, both the most grounding and the most disorienting thing about ordinary days that turned out not to be ordinary at all. They walked to the Civic. Nathan unlocked it. Owen climbed into the back seat and immediately began looking for the book he'd already put in his backpack because he'd forgotten it was there, because he was 8 and had just woken up from an accidental nap. Nathan sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the car for a moment. His phone had 17 notifications, 3 from people at the company, 2 from Priya, 1 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be Isabel's direct line. She'd sent a text that said, "Only call me anytime." This offer doesn't expire. And the rest from the ordinary administrative infrastructure of his life, indifferent to cyber attacks and boardrooms and napkin diagrams. He put the phone in his pocket. He thought about the 9 days until rent. He thought about the alternator noise. He thought about Owen's registration deposit and the state capitals quiz that Owen had apparently completely forgotten about and would be quizzed on tomorrow instead. He thought about what Isabel had said, the kind of title and compensation that should have been on the table for you a year ago. He thought about what it would mean to go back, what it would mean not to. He didn't have an answer yet. He'd said he needed to think about it, and that was true. He wasn't the kind of person who made big decisions in the first hour after a crisis, and he wasn't going to start now. "Dad," Owen said from the back seat. "Yeah." "The sandwich place closes at 3 on Tuesdays." Nathan looked at the clock on the dashboard. "It's 2:12. "We should probably go." Nathan started the car. "Yeah," he said, "we should probably go." He pulled out of the parking structure into the ordinary gray afternoon, and the city moved around them. And Owen found his book in his backpack and made a satisfied sound. And Nathan drove toward 5th Street and sandwiches, and the next thing after that. The sandwich place on 5th Street was called Henley's, and it had been there since 1987, which in Portland counted as an institution. It had a glass counter with a rotating collection of handwritten specials, a radio in the back that played classic rock at a volume just below inconvenient, and a woman named Gloria who had worked the register since at least the early 90s and who had the particular quality of remembering your order after the second visit and never making a thing of it. Owen got turkey on sourdough with extra pickles. Nathan got whatever was in front of him without really reading the board, because his brain was still running on a frequency that made ordinary decisions feel like they required more bandwidth than he had available. He paid. Gloria said, "Rough day?" in the way of someone who notices things without pressing on them, and Nathan said, "Interesting day," because that was more accurate and also the most he had. They ate at the small table near the window. Owen ate with the focused efficiency of a genuinely hungry child, not talking for the first several minutes, which Nathan was grateful for. The radio was playing a Tom Petty song. Outside, the sky had gone from flat gray to a slightly darker gray that suggested rain later. A man walked past the window with a dog that was wearing a small orange raincoat, and Owen watched the dog with the particular expression of someone whose sadness about not having a dog has settled into a kind of resigned appreciation for other people's dogs. "Do you think we'll ever get another dog?" Owen asked. Nathan took a bite of his sandwich. "Maybe." "You always say maybe." "Maybe is accurate." Owen picked a pickle off his sandwich and ate it separately. "Remy would have liked it today. He always liked when you worked from home. He'd sit under your chair." Nathan nodded. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say about Remy that wouldn't circle back to things that were too large for a Tuesday afternoon at Henley's. "I named him, you know," Owen said. "Did you know that?" "I know that. Mom let me pick." He looked out the window. "I wanted to name him Captain, but she said that was too much for a dog to live up to. She said Remy was good because it sounded like a real person's name." He paused. "She was right." "She usually was," Nathan said. Owen nodded slowly, agreeing with this as a general principle rather than as a specific point of grief, which was the particular way Owen had developed for talking about his mother. Matter of fact, precise, as if she were still an authority on things rather than an absence. Nathan had never tried to correct it or redirect it. It seemed like a reasonable approach to an unreasonable situation. They finished their sandwiches. Nathan drank his water and stared at the table and worked through what he was actually going to do. Not the philosophical version of the decision, but the practical one. The one that involved timelines and money and his son's life, and the specific reality of what saying yes to Isabel Hart meant versus what saying no meant. Saying no meant freelance work, probably. He had contacts. The resume he'd started drafting in his head at Henley's that morning, The first Henley's visit, 5 hours and a lifetime ago, was a real resume, not a desperate one. He was good enough at his work that he wouldn't starve, but there would be months of uncertainty, and Owen's registration deposit and the alternator and the particular grinding anxiety of financial instability that he'd worked for 4 years to get away from and that he did not want back. Saying yes meant going back into a building where 40 people had watched him get fired that morning. It meant working for a woman who had humiliated him in front of those 40 people and who had then, within 3 hours, brought him back in and stood in a room watching him work and said she was wrong. It meant figuring out what he actually thought about Isabel Hart, which was currently a complicated question. He thought about what she'd said, the kind of title and compensation that should have been on the table a year ago. He thought about Owen's registration deposit. He thought about what Priya's face had looked like when the last alert cleared from the screen. He was still thinking when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he recognized as belonging to Marcus Cho. Holbrook call just ended. Merger is still on. Thought you should know. Nathan read the text. Read it again. Across the table, Owen was folding his sandwich wrapper into a series of triangles with the methodical concentration of someone doing origami. He didn't look up. The merger went through, Nathan said. Owen looked up. Is that good? That's very good. For the company? For a lot of people. Nathan put his phone down. For us, probably. Owen finished his last triangle. He set it on the table and looked at it critically, then pushed it slightly to the left as if adjusting a composition. Are you going to go back? I think so. Did she ask you to? She did. Owen picked up his triangle and put it in his jacket pocket, which was where all things of value eventually ended up. Do you want to? It was the kind of question that sounded simple and wasn't. Nathan sat with it for a moment without deflecting, because Owen deserved the attempt at honesty. I want things to be okay, Nathan said finally. I want you to have a normal school year without me stressed about money. I want to work on something that actually matters. He picked up his cup. Whether I want to walk back into that specific building is a different question. Owen thought about this with his usual careful seriousness. My teacher says wanting and deciding are two different muscles. Your teacher says a lot of wise things. She also assigns a lot of homework, so... Owen shrugged. I think she's complicated. Despite everything, Nathan laughed. It came out short and rough, like something that had been sitting in his chest all day, and finally found an exit. And Owen looked at him with a small, satisfied expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. They drove home through the early afternoon rain. Nathan called Isabel that evening after Owen was in bed. He stood on the small balcony off the living room that was barely big enough for 2 people and technically belonged to the non-smoking clause of his lease, but which Nathan sometimes used to stand outside and think. And he called the number she'd texted from, and she answered on the second ring. I'll come back, he said. But I want it in writing. The title, the compensation, the terms. HR can have the offer letter to you by 9 tomorrow morning. And I want to be on the forensic investigation team. Whoever planted that hook knew our system architecture. I want to know who, and I want to understand how they got that access. A pause. That's going to be uncomfortable for some people internally. I imagine it will. Another pause. Done. And one more thing. He looked out at the wet street below, the streetlights making orange reflections in the puddles. What happened this morning doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone on my team. If there's a problem with someone's performance or their professional conduct, that conversation happens privately, not in a room full of 50 people. The pause this time was longer. You're right, she said. You're right. And I know it. She didn't say it easily, which made Nathan believe it more than if she'd said it fast. That's a commitment I'm making to you, and it's one I should be making to this whole company. Okay, Nathan said. Okay, she said. He hung up. He stood on the balcony for a few more minutes. The rain was steady and quiet and not particularly cold. Down the street, someone's wind chime was making a thin, irregular sound. The city went about its business. He went inside. The apartment was quiet. He looked at the kitchen table. The framed photo of him and Claire and Owen at the coast. Owen wet and laughing, Claire looking up at Nathan instead of the camera. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to bed. The offer letter arrived at 8:47 the next morning, before Owen had finished his cereal. Nathan read it at the kitchen table while Owen reviewed his state capitals, the quiz having been rescheduled to today by a teacher who had apparently decided mercy was a reasonable pedagogical approach. The title was Senior Director of Cybersecurity Architecture. The salary was 31% higher than what he'd been making. There was a clause about the forensic investigation, worded carefully in the language of legal departments, but clear enough in its intent. "What's that?" Owen asked. "A letter from work. Is it good?" "It's good." Nathan set the phone down. "Mississippi. Capital?" "You tell me." Owen frowned at his flashcard. "Jackson." "That's right." "I knew that one." He flipped the card. "I was just making sure you knew it too." Nathan signed the offer letter digitally at 9:03. He sent it back. He got a reply from HR within 4 minutes confirming his start date, 2 days from now, Thursday, which gave him 1 day in between that he hadn't planned for and that he decided to spend doing nothing in particular with Owen, who had a half day at school that afternoon and who needed, Nathan thought, a day that was just ordinary. They went to the Science Museum on Wednesday. Owen spent 40 minutes in the electricity exhibit, running every interactive demonstration twice, and then stood in front of a display about signal propagation for so long that Nathan came to find him and discovered him in a state of focused, private engagement with the diagram that Nathan recognized as the same expression Owen had worn drawing on the napkin at Henley's. He didn't interrupt it. He stood back and waited until Owen was ready. "This is how networks talk to each other," Owen said, pointing to the display, "like how the company's system talks to itself." "Similar idea," Nathan said. "So if something in the middle was lying, the rest of the system would believe it because it trusted the connection." Nathan looked at his son. "That is almost exactly what happened." Owen nodded slowly, fitting pieces together. "That's kind of scary." "It's the thing I work on," Nathan said, "making sure the connections are telling the truth." Owen looked at the display for another moment. "Is that why you're good at it? Because you're good at figuring out when something's wrong even when it looks okay?" Nathan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think so, yeah." Owen looked at him. "Mom was like that too. She always knew when something was wrong with me before I said anything." Nathan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the display. He thought about Claire at the kitchen table with her coffee, watching Owen over the rim of her mug with that specific, quiet attentiveness that Owen had inherited completely, and that Nathan had spent 2 years missing in a way that was so constant it had stopped being sharp and become instead a kind of permanent atmospheric pressure. "She was," Nathan said. "She really was." Owen moved to the next display. Nathan followed. They spent another 2 hours in the museum, and when they left, Owen had a small replica of a circuit board from the gift shop that he intended to take apart to see how it worked. And Nathan had a headache from the overhead fluorescent lighting and was quietly happy about both of these things. He went back to work Thursday morning. The first person he saw in the lobby was a junior engineer named Tom Briggs, who had been in the boardroom on Tuesday and who now had the expression of a man walking toward a social situation he wasn't sure how to navigate. He made eye contact with Nathan and then immediately looked uncertain about having done so. Nathan gave him a single nod, the kind that means, "We're going to act like adults about this and move forward." Tom's shoulders dropped about 2 inches with relief. "Good to have you back," Tom said. "Thanks," Nathan said, and kept walking. Priya was waiting by the elevator bank. She had her clipboard and her reading glasses on her head and her pen, which was not moving, which meant she was in a calm rather than active thinking state. She looked at Nathan when he walked up. "You okay?" she said. "I'm okay." "New title, I hear." "New title." "You deserve it." She said it plainly, without the intonation of someone fishing for a reaction, just a fact she was stating. "Thanks, Priya." The elevator arrived. They got in. She pressed 14. The doors closed. "Isabel called a leadership meeting for Friday," Priya said. "She's announcing changes to HR policy. The public humiliation thing apparently is going to be a written policy going forward." She glanced at him sideways. "I'm told you had something to do with that. I had a conversation." "The board had a conversation too, I think." She tapped her pen once against the clipboard, just once, and then stopped. "After they found out you'd been let go in front of 50 people and came back 2 hours later with the key to saving their billion-dollar deal." She paused. Apparently that sequence of events was considered somewhat embarrassing. Imagine how I felt, Nathan said. The elevator opened on 14. Priya looked at him. For what it's worth, that thing you said in the boardroom, before she took your badge, about Sentinel. She shook her head slightly. I've been thinking about that. You knew. You walked out of there knowing, and you still went. Nathan stepped out of the elevator. I had a kid with me. I went to get lunch. Nathan. Priya. She shook her head again, but she was almost smiling. Go find your new office. It has a window, by the way. An actual window. He found it. It did have a window. A real one, facing west, with a view of the West Hills and, on days without rain, the suggestion of the coast in the far distance. There was a new nameplate on the door that someone had put up already. Nathan Reed, Senior Director, Cybersecurity Architecture. The nameplate was slightly crooked. He looked at it for a moment. He didn't straighten it. He went inside and sat down and started work. The forensic investigation began the following Monday and ran for 6 weeks. Nathan was one of 4 people on the core team, alongside a forensic specialist from an outside firm named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, who had 20 years in the field and a flat, methodical approach to evidence that Nathan found immediately reassuring. They worked through the intrusion architecture in layers: the planted certificate, the hook and the scan subroutine, the dormancy trigger, and eventually the trail of access logs that told the story of how all 3 had gotten into the system in the first place. The story turned out to be both complicated and depressingly straightforward. It involved a contract employee who had left the company 7 months earlier under circumstances that at the time had seemed routine, a private consulting arrangement with a competitor that the former employee had not disclosed, and a set of credentials that had been copied rather than revoked at exit because the offboarding process for contractors had a gap that nobody had caught because nobody had been looking. The former employee's name was Raymond Gould. He was 41 years old and had been at Veridian for 11 months as a network architecture consultant. Nathan had met him twice. He didn't have a strong memory of him. Average height, precise in his speech, the kind of person who came to meetings on time and left exactly when they ended and didn't generate much social friction in either direction. He had cost the company nearly its most important deal in a decade, and he'd done it for $200,000 from a competitor who had wanted the Holbrook merger to fall apart. When the forensic report was complete and Yolanda delivered her findings to the board, she described the intrusion as professionally executed and designed specifically to exploit Veridian's own automated recovery systems. She described the planting of the hook as requiring detailed insider knowledge. She noted that the attack would almost certainly have succeeded if the discovery of the scan subroutine exploitation had not occurred when it did. She did not, in the formal report, mention how the discovery had been made. Nathan mentioned it when the board asked him to speak. He was standing at the front of the boardroom, the same long, dark table, the same floor-to-ceiling windows with the same Portland skyline. And there were 8 board members, and Isabel and Marcus and Priya, and 4 members of the legal team, and Yolanda Ferris. And he stood up there with his notes, and he said everything factual and technical that needed to be said. And then at the end he said, I want to be clear about one thing regarding the initial discovery. I identified the Sentinel vulnerability in the system logs. Yes, but the specific pattern in the scan subroutine that led to finding the hook that was noticed by my son. He was 8 years old and he'd been watching the monitors during the crisis meeting, and he noticed that a particular sequence ran twice in reverse direction. He drew it on a napkin from the diner where I'd taken him for lunch after I was... He paused for a half second. After I left the building. Without that observation, I don't know how long it would have taken the team to find the hook, long enough that the attack might have completed its objective. The boardroom was quiet. I'm not saying that for any particular effect, Nathan added. I'm saying it because it's what happened, and accurate records matter, especially for this investigation. He sat down. Isabel, across the table, was looking at him. Her expression was the controlled, readable version of something that was privately larger. Nathan was learning gradually to read the difference. Board member Gerald Webb, who was 73 and had a reputation for saying blunt things in important meetings, said, "The child should be recognized." "I agree," Isabel said. She said it without hesitation, which Nathan noted. "In what capacity?" another board member asked. "I'm working on that," Isabel said. She was. Nathan knew she was because Priya had mentioned it, and because Isabel had stopped by Nathan's office twice in the past 3 weeks, under the auspices of checking on the investigation timeline. And both times she had asked a question about Owen that had nothing to do with the investigation. Once about his school, once about whether he was interested in technology as a general area, or specifically in systems work. Nathan had answered both times without making it obvious that he noticed the questions were really about something else. He wasn't sure yet what to make of Isabel Hart. He was putting the picture together slowly, the way you put together a picture of anyone, not from a single gesture or a single conversation, but from the accumulation of small evidences. The board call at 6 in the morning, the call to Priya 40 minutes after he'd left, the offer letter at 8:47, the policy meeting on Friday, the slightly crooked nameplate that had been on his door when he arrived, which meant someone had put it up the night before, which meant someone had cared enough to do that. He was building a revised version of who she was, and he didn't have enough pieces yet to be sure. But the pieces he had were more complicated and more human than the flat surface he'd seen in the hallway conversation 14 months ago and in the boardroom on Tuesday morning. He thought about what Owen had said at Henley's. "You were having a bad day." My teacher says that's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. He thought about how his teacher was right and how Owen was right, and how the difference between an excuse and an explanation was exactly the kind of thing that mattered and was easy to collapse under pressure. 4 weeks after he came back, Nathan was in his office, the one with the actual window facing the West Hills, when Owen texted him from Sandra Kowalski's phone, because Owen still didn't have his own phone, and the question of when that would change was a separate ongoing negotiation. The text said, "Hi, it's Owen. Mrs. K says dinner is pasta tonight. Do you want me to tell her extra garlic or regular?" Nathan typed back, "Extra garlic always." 3 seconds later, "That's what I said. See you later." Nathan put his phone down and looked at the West Hills through the window. It had rained again that morning, and the hills were very green against the low cloud cover, the kind of green that was particular to the Pacific Northwest in fall, that saturated, oversaturated green that always looked slightly artificial even when you were looking directly at it. He thought about the day 6 weeks ago when he had sat in this building's parking structure for 2 minutes before starting the car, looking at his 8-year-old in the rear-view mirror while the city moved indifferently around them. He thought about the way that moment had felt like a bottom. Not the most dramatic bottom of the past 2 years. Nothing would be that, but a bottom of its own specific kind. A professional and financial and logistical bottom that had arrived on the same Tuesday as the worst attack in the company's history and an 8-year-old with a chapter book and a puzzle book and enough quarters for the vending machine. He thought about Owen at the Science Museum, standing in front of the signal propagation display, quietly connecting what he'd seen there to what he'd seen on the boardroom monitors and to the work his father did at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings, making sure the connections are telling the truth. He sat there for a moment with that. Then he picked up his phone and called Sandra Kowalski and told her extra garlic, and she said she already knew because Owen had told her, and Nathan said he wasn't surprised, and she laughed. He went back to work. The annual Innovation Conference was held in November, which in Portland meant cold, clear air and the smell of wood smoke from somewhere, and the particular quality of November light that was lower and more amber than summer light and made everything look slightly like a memory of itself. The Viridian Conference was a company tradition, 3 years running, a combination of internal presentations and industry networking that had grown from 100 people to nearly 800, held at the convention center downtown. Nathan had attended the previous 2 as a senior engineer, sitting in the middle rows, listening to presentations that were sometimes interesting and sometimes were extended performance reviews dressed as innovation talks. He'd taken notes both years out of professional habit and left both years with the vague satisfaction of someone who has fulfilled an obligation efficiently. This year was different, and he knew it was going to be different because Priya had come to his office 11 days before the conference with a particular expression and said, "Isabel wants to talk to you about the conference program." He met with Isabel in her office, the corner office on the 16th floor that he'd been in exactly once before, briefly, for a 15-minute briefing. It was a large office, aggressively organized, with a whiteboard along one wall covered in frameworks and questions written in a small, precise hand. There were no personal photos on her desk. There was a single framed thing on the wall that Nathan looked at while she closed the door. It was a quote, but he was too far away to read it. She told him what she was planning, She told him she wanted to speak publicly about what had happened. Not the technical details of the breach, which were still under legal confidentiality, but the human story of it. The decision she'd made in the boardroom. What it had cost. What had happened afterward. She told him she'd talked to the board about making it the central theme of a leadership address. The idea that company culture has to account for the full human reality of the people who do the work. I want Owen there, she said. If you're willing, if he's willing. Nathan looked at her. Why? Because he's the clearest part of the story. She leaned forward slightly in her chair. Not as a prop, Nathan. I want to be clear. I'm not putting an 8-year-old on stage to make a good optic. I want him there because what happened is real, and he was the center of it, and pretending otherwise would be the same kind of management I'm trying to move away from. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Owen at the diner drawing on the napkin. Owen in the infrastructure room asleep against the wall. Owen saying, did the pattern thing work in a rough, just woken voice, while the monitors behind him ran calm and quiet for the first time all day. I'll ask him, Nathan said. It's his call. Isabel nodded. Tell him I said it's an important ask. Tell him I said he can say no. I'll tell him. He told Owen that evening at the kitchen table after the extra garlic pasta. He explained what the conference was, what Isabel wanted to do, what it would mean. Standing in front of a lot of people, having their story told in front of them, being acknowledged in public in a way that was going to be, Nathan said honestly, a little overwhelming. Owen listened to the whole thing. He ate 3 more bites of pasta while thinking about it. She's going to tell the story about firing you? Owen said. That's part of it, yeah. In front of everyone who was there? In front of everyone who was there, and about 700 other people. Owen considered this. His expression was the particular combination of serious and slightly mischievous that meant he was calculating something. Is she going to say she was wrong? That's the plan. Out loud? On purpose? Out loud? On purpose? In front of 800 people. Owen nodded slowly. He picked up his fork. Okay, he said. I'll go. Nathan looked at him. That's your condition? She says she was wrong in public? It's important, Owen said simply. If you made a mistake and you don't say it out loud, you only said sorry in your head. That doesn't count. Nathan sat with that for a moment. Your teacher again? That one's for me, Owen said. Nathan looked at his son across the dinner table, at the Trailblazers shirt and the dark hair that went flat on one side when he slept on it, and the steady, unguarded eyes that held everything without pretending otherwise. He thought about what it cost sometimes to keep going, what it actually cost, in the currency of ordinary days and ordinary meals, and the specific, relentless work of being present when presence was the last thing you had. He thought about what it had made. Okay, Nathan said. I'll tell her you're in. Owen finished his pasta. He pushed his bowl to the side and picked up the circuit board he'd taken apart from the Science Museum gift shop and had been slowly reassembling for 3 days, examining each component with a small flashlight he kept in his jacket pocket for exactly this kind of situation. He held a small resistor up to the light. Dad. Yeah, I've been thinking about how the thing worked. The attack thing. He turned the resistor between his fingers. The system trusted the recovery program because the recovery program was supposed to be safe. But it wasn't. It was lying. He put the resistor down carefully. Is that how most of them work? They use the thing that's supposed to protect you. Nathan thought about Raymond Gould. He thought about the planted certificate and the dormancy trigger and 41 gigabytes of merger data. He thought about Sentinel cycling through its recovery protocol 14 times in one morning, each cycle a door opening, each door a gift. A lot of them, he said. Yeah. Owen nodded, fitting this into a larger framework he was apparently building. So the job is figuring out which safe things aren't safe. That's a pretty good summary. It sounds hard. It is. Owen looked at the disassembled circuit board. But you're good at it. I'm working on it, Nathan said. Outside, the November rain had started, quiet and persistent against the windows. The apartment was warm. The kitchen table held the remains of dinner and a half-reassembled circuit board and a set of State Capitol's flashcards that Owen had stopped needing weeks ago but kept around the way you keep around something that helped you get through something hard. The framed photo of the three of them was still pushed to one side. Nathan hadn't moved it. He looked at it sometimes, and he didn't look at it other times, and that was an ongoing negotiation he was conducting privately, in his own time, at his own pace. He thought, 3 weeks from now, his 8-year-old son was going to stand in front of 800 people in a convention center in Portland and receive recognition for drawing a pencil diagram on a diner napkin that had saved a billion-dollar merger. He thought, the day you think your life has fallen apart is sometimes the day it starts going somewhere. He didn't say that. He didn't write it down. He just thought it, quietly, at the kitchen table, while the rain fell and Owen studied a resistor and the city kept its ordinary November business. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to be true. He started clearing the dishes. Owen put down the resistor and helped without being asked. The rain kept coming, steady and patient, the way rain comes in November in Portland. Not angry, not dramatic, just present, just doing what it does. The conference was 3 weeks away when Isabel Hart started having trouble sleeping. This was not, in itself, unusual. She had a long history with insomnia, had since college, when she'd trained herself to run on 5 hours and fill the gaps with work, which her professors had praised and her roommate had found slightly alarming. Sleep had always been something that happened to her incidentally, between tasks, rather than something she sought. She was good at functioning tired. She'd built her entire professional life on being good at functioning tired. But this was different from the productive insomnia of her 20s. This was the kind of lying awake that didn't come with the compensating hum of ideas and plans. This was just awake at 2 or 3 in the morning in the apartment she'd lived in for 14 months and still hadn't fully furnished because she kept meaning to get to it and kept finding other things to do first. The couch was good. The bed was good. There were boxes in the second bedroom that she'd told herself were temporary and which had now been there long enough to qualify as furniture. She would lie there and look at the ceiling and think about the boardroom. Not the attack, not the merger, not the hook in the scan subroutine, not Raymond Gould and his $200,000 and his quiet, methodical betrayal. She thought about those things during the day, in the forensic meetings and the legal calls and the board briefings, and she had enough professional machinery to process them in daylight. What she thought about at 2 in the morning was the exact moment Nathan Reed had set his badge on the table. The sound of it. The specific quality of that sound. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a small, flat sound of something being put down. A person putting down the thing that represented their belonging in a place and then picking up their child's hand and walking out. She'd been replaying it for weeks. She couldn't stop replaying it. And the thing that made it worse was that she knew, with the precise self-knowledge she sometimes wished she had less of, exactly why she'd done it. Not the reason she'd given herself in the moment, which was about optics and board perception and crisis management, but the actual reason underneath that one. She'd been frightened, not of the breach. She could handle a breach. She'd been frightened of the room, of 50 people watching her manage a catastrophe and finding her insufficient. She'd needed to demonstrate control at the exact moment she had least of it, and Nathan had been the most convenient available target. She knew this because she'd done versions of it before, smaller ones earlier in her career, when she'd been less powerful and therefore more afraid. She'd gotten better at disguising it as decisiveness. She hadn't gotten better at not doing it. She thought about Owen watching his father hand over his badge. She thought about what that had looked like to an 8-year-old. She thought about what it would have looked like to her at 8. She had been 8 once. She could remember it clearly if she tried, which she usually didn't, because her memory of being 8 was not particularly comfortable, and she'd spent considerable energy building a professional identity that had nothing to do with the child she'd been. Her parents had both worked. Her mother was a corporate attorney, her father a cardiologist, and their household had operated on a scheduling system that was efficient and reliable and not especially warm. They loved her. She'd never doubted that exactly. But love in her family had been expressed primarily through investment. The right schools, the tutors, the after-school programs, the college applications. She had been, from a very young age, a project. A successful one, by most measures, but a project. She remembered being 8 and sitting in the waiting area of her mother's law firm while her mother finished a meeting that had run long, and the waiting area had leather chairs and very old magazines and a receptionist who'd given her a granola bar and then gone back to ignoring her. She remembered the length of that wait, She remembered learning in that wait that important work happened in rooms you weren't in, and that the correct response to that fact was patience and self-sufficiency and not being a disruption. She had been patient. She had been self-sufficient. She had spent the next 22 years not being a disruption, and she had been very successful at it. And she was only now lying awake at 2 in the morning in an underfurnished apartment in Portland, beginning to think that the thing she'd learned in that waiting room was at least partially wrong. She thought about Nathan Reed standing at the end of the boardroom table saying for the record, "I think I know why the attack keeps adapting," and then picking up his son's hand and walking out. She thought about the fact that he was right, that he had stood there, having just been publicly humiliated and told the room something important and true, and then left with dignity, and that the room had let him go. She thought about what she would have had to be to do that. She wasn't sure she would have done it. She wasn't sure if the positions had been reversed, that she would have had the self-possession to say something useful on the way out the door rather than something cutting. She'd always thought of herself as controlled, but Nathan Reed had been controlled in a way that was different from her version of it. Not controlled like a surface that doesn't crack, but controlled like someone who has decided what matters and keeps deciding it even when it costs something. She lay there and thought about this until the alarm went off at 5:45, and then she got up and made coffee and went back to work, which was the only honest answer she'd ever found to the questions that didn't have easier answers. She called her assistant at 8 that morning and asked for 30 minutes cleared on Thursday afternoon. No meeting, no calls. So just the window and the skyline and whatever she needed to think about before she stood on a stage in front of 800 people and said out loud on purpose that she had been wrong. The Thursday afternoon she'd cleared turned out to be necessary in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window in her office, coffee cup in hand, watching the November light sit low and amber on the West Hills, when her assistant knocked and said Nathan Reed was asking if she had a few minutes. She said yes. He came in with 2 folders under his arm and the slightly careful expression of a person who has decided to raise something they've been thinking about for a while and are not certain how it will be received. He sat in the chair across from her desk without waiting to be invited, which she'd noticed he'd started doing after he came back. A small, quiet assertion of changed terms that she found reasonable and hadn't remarked on. "The conference program," he said. "What about it?" "Priya showed me the draft. The section about what you're planning to say." He set one of the folders on her desk. "It's good. It's accurate. I don't have any changes to the facts." "But," she said, "but there's a section about company culture and the changes you're implementing. The family support programs, the flexible scheduling, the childcare assistance." He paused. "It's framed as a response to what happened with me, to the firing." "It is a response to what happened. I know. But the way it's currently drafted makes it sound like the policy changes are like they're coming from guilt, like you're doing them because of what happened to me specifically." He looked at her steadily. "I think that's the wrong frame." Isabel looked at him. "What's the right frame?" "That you did something that revealed a problem that was already there, a structural problem. The fact that a senior engineer had no viable childcare option on a day when the company needed him, that's not a personal failing. That's a systemic gap." He paused. "The story isn't that you fired me and felt bad and changed things. The story is that you fired me and it showed you something true about how this company was built, and you decided to rebuild that part of it." He set the folder down. "Those are different stories. One is about you feeling sorry. The other is about you actually learning something." Isabel looked at the folder. She looked at him. She put down her coffee cup. "You came to my office to tell me how to better frame my apology," she said. "I came to your office to tell you how to make it mean something beyond tonight," he said. "The apology is yours. The policy changes are everyone's. Those are different things, and they shouldn't be tangled together." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November light was doing its low amber thing across the hills, and the city was making its regular city sounds, and the office was warm and still in the particular way that offices get when everyone else on the floor is busy and one room has gone quiet. "You're right," she said. "I know." She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. Neither of them quite made it, but it was the closest they'd gotten, and they both noticed it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." Why did you come back? She watched him. Not the practical reasons, Ugh. I know the practical reasons. I offered you a good package and you needed stability for Owen, and the practical reasons made sense. But you could have negotiated those from somewhere else eventually. She paused. Why here specifically? Nathan looked at the window. He seemed to be deciding how honest to be. Not deciding whether to lie, but deciding how much of the truth was relevant to share with someone he was still in the process of determining whether to trust fully. Because I'd been here 4 years, he said. Because I know these systems. Because the work is real and it matters. He paused. And because of what you did when you called Priya. I called to bring you back. You called 40 minutes after you fired me, before you knew what I'd found, before you knew there was anything to find. He looked at her directly. You called because you thought you'd made a mistake, not because of what it might cost you, just because you thought you were wrong. Isabel was quiet. That's not nothing, Nathan said. I've worked for people who don't do that. It's not nothing. She looked at the window. She thought about the 2 minutes after she'd watched Nathan and Owen leave the boardroom. The particular quality of silence in the room afterward, the way everyone had gone carefully back to the crisis at hand without quite meeting her eyes, and the things she'd felt watching the door close that she'd spent 4 hours trying to identify before she'd finally admitted to herself it was shame. Clean, uncomfortable shame. Not the performative kind she sometimes saw in executives during PR crises. The real kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone and doesn't dissolve until you've done something about it. She'd picked up the phone and called Priya because the stone had been intolerable and doing nothing about it had been worse. I need to tell you something, she said. Nathan waited. She turned from the window. She stood there for a moment with her arms slightly crossed. Not defensive, more self-contained. The posture of someone gathering something that lives in a part of themselves they don't access at work. I grew up in a family where the rule was, you don't let your personal life affect your professional performance. You keep those things separate, you handle your private difficulties privately, and you do not bring them into the room. She paused. It worked. I was good at it. I built an entire career on being good at it. She looked at him. And then you walked into my boardroom with your son during the worst crisis of my professional life, and everything I'd built my instincts on said, that is the problem. That is the disruption. Remove it. Nathan said nothing. I was wrong, she said, but I wasn't wrong randomly. I was wrong in a way that came from something I'd believed for a long time and had never examined because it had always produced results. She paused. When Owen said, at the museum, what you told me, he said, about connections telling the truth. She stopped. I keep thinking about that. The recovery system was designed to fix things, but it had been compromised at the level of its basic function. It thought it was doing its job. It was doing the opposite. Nathan looked at her. I'm not saying I'm a malware, she said. I'm saying I understand the architecture of the problem better than I did 4 months ago. He sat with that for a moment. That's a hell of a thing to figure out about yourself. It's uncomfortable. Most useful things are. She looked at him. The November light moved on the wall between them. I'm going to say all of this on Friday. Not like this. Not the technical metaphor, that would be terrible, Nathan said. Terrible, she agreed. But the substance, the thing about what I'd been built to believe, about what seeing Owen showed me. She paused. I'm going to say it in front of 800 people and I'm going to mean it, which I recognize is a very easy thing to say and a harder thing to prove. You prove it over time, Nathan said, not in a speech. I know. She uncrossed her arms. But you start somewhere. Nathan nodded. He picked up his folder from the desk. I'll work on the reframe for the policy section. Send you a draft by tomorrow. You don't have to. I'm invested in it being right, he said simply. It affects my team. He stood up. He was at the door when she said his name. He turned. She looked at him from across the office, in the amber November light, and for a moment she looked less like a CEO in a charcoal blazer and more like someone who had been very far from certain people for a very long time and had recently, and not entirely comfortably, started moving in a different direction. Tell Owen I said thank you, she said. Not for the company, for... Just tell him I said it. Nathan nodded. I will. He went back to his office. She stood at the window for a while longer. The night before the conference, Nathan couldn't get Owen to sleep. This was not, strictly speaking, unusual. Owen had always been a late sleeper, a child whose brain ran on a schedule that was perpetually 20 minutes behind the one his body needed. But tonight, there was a specific charged quality to the wakefulness, an 8-year-old version of pre-event anxiety that manifested as appearing in the kitchen doorway 3 times between 8:30 and 10, each time with a different ostensibly practical concern. The first time it was water. The second time it was a question about whether he needed to wear a tie. The third time he just stood in the doorway and looked at Nathan without saying anything, which was the most honest version. Nathan was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking and the conference program on his laptop, reading through it one more time without really reading it. He looked up when Owen appeared in the doorway the third time. "Come sit down," Nathan said. Owen came and sat at the table. He was wearing the Portland Trail Blazers shirt and the sweatpants with the hole in the left knee, and his hair was flat on one side. He pulled a knee up to his chest and wrapped his arms around it and sat there looking at the table. "Nervous?" Nathan asked. "A little," Owen said. "I don't know what to do with my hands." Nathan looked at him. "What? When I'm standing in front of people, I never know what to do with my hands. I always end up just holding them weird." Nathan thought about the various presentations and school assemblies he'd sat through, watching Owen on a stage, and realized Owen was right. There was a consistent and endearing hand placement uncertainty that he'd never thought to address. "Just let them hang," Nathan said, "at your sides. You'll want to fidget with them, but just let them hang and eventually it stops feeling weird." Owen considered this. "What if I forget to do that and I start holding them weird again?" "Then you hold them weird for a minute and nobody notices or cares." "You'd notice?" "I would notice and I wouldn't care." Owen unwrapped his knee and put both feet on the floor. He sat with his hands in his lap, clearly practicing letting them be there. "What's it going to be like? The room?" "Big," Nathan said honestly. A lot of people. But you're not doing anything except standing there while someone else talks. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to perform anything. Just stand there. Just stand there." Owen thought about this. "Is Ms. Hart nervous?" Nathan hadn't considered this. He thought about Isabel at the window on Thursday afternoon, arms slightly crossed, telling him about a waiting room and leather chairs in her mother's law firm. "Probably yes," he said. "She's going to say something hard in front of a lot of people. That's always uncomfortable." "Is she going to cry?" "I sincerely doubt it. My teacher cried when she talked about her dog dying," Owen said. "At school, in front of everyone. And then she was embarrassed, but then she said actually she wasn't embarrassed because it was real." He picked at the hole in his sweatpants knee. "I thought that was brave." "It is brave," Nathan said. "Differently brave than what Ms. Hart is doing, but both count." Owen nodded slowly. He looked at the framed photo that was still on the edge of the kitchen table. He looked at it without any particular expression. Not sad, not nostalgic, just present with it. "Do you think Mom would have thought this was funny?" he asked. Nathan looked at the photo, too. Owen at the coast, soaking wet and laughing. Claire looking up. "Which part?" Nathan said. "The whole thing, the napkin. Me figuring out the computer thing." He paused. "She would have thought that was cool, right? She always said I notice things." "She always said you notice things," Nathan confirmed. "She said it all the time. She said it from when you were really little. She said you were the most observant person she'd ever met, and that it would take you somewhere someday." He stopped, cleared his throat slightly. She was right. Owen looked at the photo for another moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "Do you still miss her a lot?" Nathan held the question for a second before answering, the way he'd learned to with Owen. Not deflecting, not rushing, just holding it and being honest about the weight of it. "Every day," he said. "Less like a wound now, and more like she's still here but in a different form, like she's part of how we work, you and me, part of how we do things." Owen seemed to be placing this against something internal. Then he nodded. The deliberate, slightly formal nod he had when he was accepting something he intended to keep. "Okay," he said. "I'm going to try to sleep." "Okay." He got up. He was almost to the hallway when he turned back. "Dad?" "Yeah." The good eggs tomorrow morning? Nathan hadn't been planning breakfast. He'd been planning to get them both up and dressed and out on time, which with a conference at 9 and a child who moved at Owen's morning pace was already a scheduling challenge. But he looked at his son standing in the kitchen doorway in the Trailblazers shirt and the holy sweatpants, and he thought, of course. Good eggs tomorrow morning, he said. Owen disappeared down the hallway. Nathan heard the creak of his door, the particular squeaky third floorboard, the sound of Owen getting back into bed. He sat at the table for a while longer. He drank his tea, which had gone cold. He closed the laptop without reading the conference program one more time, because he knew what it said, and reading it again was the kind of circular behavior that never actually helped, and he'd gotten better at recognizing it. He looked at the photo of the three of them. He said not out loud, not a spoken thing, just an internal acknowledgement to the version of Claire that lived in the architectural bones of his daily life. You were right about him. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The Viridian Annual Innovation Conference was held at the Oregon Convention Center, in a hall large enough to seat 1,000 people, with a stage at the front that was professionally lit in the warm blue and white tones of a company that spent a reasonable amount of its event budget on making things look intentional. There were round tables with the company logo on the centerpieces and a coffee station along the back wall that had been mobbed since 7:30, and a quiet, building energy of 800 people who had come for the official programming but were also running the informal parallel program of professional networking and industry gossip that is the real function of every corporate conference everywhere. Nathan arrived at 8:15 with Owen, who was wearing a button-down shirt that was slightly too large in the shoulders and had his hair combed in a way that would not survive the morning. Owen had managed not to hold his hands weird during the entire drive over, which he reported with the satisfaction of someone who had practiced something and found it worked. Priya met them near the entrance. She was in a dark green dress and had her reading glasses on her head in the usual position and her clipboard, though the clipboard today seemed more ceremonial than functional. She looked at Owen. "You look great," she said. "My hands are okay," Owen said. She looked at Nathan, who gave a minimal shake of his head that communicated, "Long story, don't ask." She accepted this and moved on. Marcus was already inside talking to someone from the board. Sheila waved from across the room. She'd gotten a promotion 2 weeks after the forensic investigation concluded, which Nathan had advocated for, and which she'd received with the particular grace of someone who knew they'd earned it and was glad someone else knew it too. David Park was at the coffee station talking to Yolanda Ferris, who had apparently been invited as a guest presenter and was wearing the same flat, methodical expression she'd worn in every forensic meeting, which Nathan found oddly comforting. Owen took everything in with wide, processing eyes and said nothing. He stayed close to Nathan without being told to, navigating the room with the self-possession of a child who has learned, through the particular education of the past 2 years, that unfamiliar situations are manageable if you pay attention to them. At 8:55, a conference staffer came to find them and walked them toward the backstage area. Nathan had been told he and Owen would sit in the front row and come up at a specific point in Isabel's address. Simple, contained. Come up, stand there, receive a thing, stand there some more while people clapped, go back. He'd explained this to Owen twice, and Owen had said both times, "I know, Dad. I can stand." Backstage was a small holding area, a curtained corridor with monitors showing the stage feed and a few folding chairs. Isabel was there. She was in a dark charcoal blazer, different from the one she'd worn in the boardroom, but the same register, the same quality of controlled presentation. Her hair was down tonight, which Nathan hadn't seen before, and it made her look slightly less like the version of herself she deployed in board meetings and slightly more like the version Nathan had glimpsed in the Thursday afternoon conversation at her office window. She looked at Owen when they came in. "Hi," Owen said. He said it the way he'd said it in the infrastructure room, direct and unguarded, the uncomplicated greeting of a child who has already decided the person in front of him is not a threat. "Hi," Isabel said. She crouched down to his level in a slightly awkward way, the way adults do when they're not around children enough to do it naturally. "How are you feeling?" "Okay," Owen said. "My hands are fine." She looked at him. "Your hands?" "I had a plan for them," Owen said. "It's working." Something shifted in her expression, brief and genuine. The kind of thing that bypassed the professional exterior because it happened too fast to catch. Good, she said. I'm glad. She stood back up. She looked at Nathan. In the monitor overhead, the hall was visible. 800 seats filling steadily, the blue-white stage lights catching the company logo backdrop. The particular ambient sound of a large room finding its level. You okay? Nathan asked. Working on it, she said. That's all you can do. She nodded. She looked at the monitor. I rewrote the opening 3 times last night. Did you get it right? I don't know. I'll know when I say it out loud. She paused. That's the thing about the hard version of anything. You can prepare for it, but you don't know what it actually costs until you're doing it. From beyond the curtain, Nathan could hear the conference host beginning introductions. The standard preamble of a well-run corporate event, the names and titles and achievements that frame a speaker before the speaker speaks. Isabel straightened. She took one breath that was visible and deliberate, and then she was the other version of herself again. Contained, ready, the surface that had gotten her to this stage in the first place. But Nathan had just seen the breath, and the 3 rewrites, and the slightly awkward crouch, and the working on it. He thought, there's a real person in there, and she's been in there the whole time, and the question is whether what's happened in the past few months has given her reason to let that person have a little more room. He didn't know yet. He was still accumulating evidence. Go ahead, he said. You've got this. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she walked through the curtain and onto the stage, and 800 people started clapping, and the conference began. Nathan and Owen went around to the front and found their seats in the front row, which had small reserved cards on them that Owen examined and then placed carefully in his shirt pocket, the way he placed all things he intended to keep. The room settled. The applause ended. The monitors on either side of the stage lit up with Isabel's face in close-up, clear and steady. She began to speak. She started with the breach, the technical facts of it, kept accessible, no jargon, the story of a billion-dollar deal almost destroyed by an attack hidden inside the company's own systems. She talked about the morning of the crisis, the emergency response, the board calls. She talked about it factually and without drama for about 4 minutes, and the room listened with the focused attention of people who had been living with the story in its various versions for 2 months and were finally hearing it from the center. Then she stopped. Nathan watched her on the monitor, watched the fraction of a second where the prepared material gave way to the other thing, the part that was real in a different way than the facts were real. I made a decision that morning, she said, that I want to talk about. Not the technical decisions. Those are in the report and they're well documented. She paused. I want to talk about a decision I made in this company's boardroom that had nothing to do with cybersecurity and everything to do with who I was as a leader. The room was very quiet. Owen, beside Nathan, had his hands in his lap. They were fine. Isabel told the story. She told it plainly, not floridly, not with the performed vulnerability of someone doing a TED Talk version of accountability, but in the specific, factual language of someone describing something they had done and were not going to dress up. She told them about Nathan and Owen arriving in the boardroom. She told them what she'd said and how she'd said it. She told them what had happened after. I made that decision, she said, because I was afraid of the room, because I had been trained by the culture of this company and by years of professional habit before I got here, to believe that personal circumstances were a disruption to be managed, that bringing your life into the building was a failure of professionalism. She paused. I was wrong. I was wrong about the policy, and I was wrong about the man standing in front of me, and I was deeply and specifically wrong to do it the way I did it. She looked out at the room looked back. What happened next is why we're all here tonight, she said. A senior engineer took his son to lunch, and over lunch, his 8-year-old son drew something on a napkin that changed the outcome of everything. Nathan felt Owen shift slightly in his seat beside him. He didn't look over. He kept his eyes forward. She told the rest of it. The napkin, the pattern, the hook in the scan subroutine, the isolation sequence and the 41 gigabytes and the phone call from Holbrook Legal that had come in while the team was still catching its breath. She told it with the same clean factual precision, and the room stayed quiet through all of it. And when she said an 8-year-old boy noticed what 50 trained engineers had missed, there was a sound in the room that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence, but was somewhere in between. I want to say something about that, Isabel said. Not about the technical observation. That's remarkable, and I mean that, but about why it happened. It happened because a father raised his son to pay attention, to ask questions, to sit at the kitchen table and watch and wonder why things work the way they work. It happened because that father, despite being fired, despite being publicly humiliated, despite having every reason to walk away and not look back, brought what he knew back into a room that had just told him he didn't belong there. She stopped. That's not just intelligence, that's character. And this company is standing here tonight, merger intact because of it. She looked at the front row. Nathan, Owen, will you come up? Nathan stood. Owen stood beside him, and his hands were at his sides, and they were fine. They walked up the 3 steps to the stage, and Nathan was aware of the size of the room in a way he hadn't been from his seat. 800 faces in the warm light, the quiet, attentive quality of a large audience that is genuinely present. He stood beside Isabel. Owen stood on Nathan's other side. Isabel reached off stage and took something from a staffer. A box, modest-sized, dark navy with the company logo. She crouched down, properly this time, not awkwardly, like she'd thought about how to do it. She held out the box to Owen. "This is for you," she said, "for noticing what everyone else missed." Owen looked at the box. He took it. He held it in both hands and looked at Isabel, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was private in the way that real things sometimes are, even on stages in front of 800 people. "Thank you," Owen said. "Thank you," Isabel said. Owen opened the box. Inside, nested in dark velvet, was a crystal award, clear and substantial, catching the stage lights and splitting them into small spectral pieces. Engraved on the base, in simple, clean lettering, were 4 words: "The boy who saved us." Owen looked at it for a long moment. He turned it slightly in the light. He read the words on the base carefully, the way he read everything. Not skimming, actually reading. Then he looked out at the room. 800 people looked back at an 8-year-old boy in a slightly too large button-down shirt, holding a crystal award that caught the light and threw it in every direction. And there was a moment of collective, charged quiet before someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the whole room, all at once, standing. Nathan stood beside his son while the applause built and filled the convention hall, and he looked not at the room, but at Owen. At the slight flush in his son's ears, and the way he held the award carefully with both hands, and the small, private, genuine smile that appeared on his face not for the audience but for the award itself, for the words on the base, for the specific satisfaction of a thing being recognized as real. He thought about 6:47 in the morning, and the good eggs, and a babysitter's cancellation text, and a boy who brought a chapter book and a puzzle book, and enough quarters for the vending machine, and who had sat in the boardroom of a company in crisis and noticed, in 30 seconds of quiet watching, what no one else had. He thought about a napkin in his jacket pocket, still there, because he'd never taken it out. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. He just stood there on the stage, in the light, next to the person who had, in one form or another, been saving him for 8 years. The applause kept going. Owen looked up at him. Nathan looked down. No words, nothing needed. Then Owen looked back at the room, still holding the award, still with that small, honest smile. And Nathan looked at the room too, and let it be what it was. The applause in the convention hall lasted longer than anyone had planned for. The conference schedule had allocated 4 minutes for the recognition segment. The standing ovation ran for nearly 9. The event coordinator, a meticulous woman named Patricia, who had been running corporate conferences for 15 years and had never once let a program run over by more than 2 minutes, stood at the side of the stage with her clipboard and her earpiece and watched the clock and decided, for the first time in her professional memory, that the schedule could wait. Owen stood on the stage with the Crystal Award in both hands for the full 9 minutes. He didn't wave. He didn't perform anything. He stood there with the honest, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving something real, and when the applause finally began to settle and people returned to their seats, he looked up at Nathan with an expression that contained, in equal measure, relief and a kind of quiet wonder at what had just happened to him. They walked off the stage together. Isabel followed. The 3 of them stood briefly in the wings while the conference host moved back to the podium to introduce the next segment, and the ordinary machinery of the event resumed around them, like a river flowing back into its channel after something large had moved through it. Owen looked at the award, He looked at it the way he'd looked at the circuit board from the Science Museum gift shop, with the focused, proprietary attention of someone examining something that now belongs to them and is deciding where it fits in the order of important things. "It's heavier than I thought it would be," he said. "Crystal usually is," Nathan said. Can I put it on my desk at home?" "You can put it wherever you want." Owen considered the available surface area of his bedroom desk, which was currently occupied by the reassembled circuit board, a collection of rocks he'd been building since age 5, and a photograph of Remy that he'd printed at school and taped to the wall above it. "I'll figure out the arrangement," he said. Isabel was watching him. She had the look she sometimes got around Owen, a kind of careful attention, like someone in the presence of something they're not entirely sure how to categorize but know is worth paying attention to. "You handled that well," she said to him. Owen looked up. "My hands were fine the whole time. I noticed. I practiced. It showed." She straightened. Around them, the backstage area was beginning to settle. Staffer conversations, the quiet churn of post-segment logistics. She looked at Nathan. There was something in her expression that was harder to read than usual, or maybe it was the opposite. Easier, more unguarded, the way faces sometimes go after a person has said the thing they were most afraid to say and found out it didn't kill them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Both of them," the words meant. "Both of you." "Thank you for doing it right," Nathan said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm still working on that." "I know," he said. "So am I." She nodded once, the small, private nod of two people arriving at a mutual understanding that doesn't require more words than it's already used. Then she turned back toward the stage, because the conference had more programming and she had a company to run, and that was the shape of things. Nathan and Owen found their seats in the front row. Owen put the award carefully under his chair, where he could feel it with his foot, and watched the rest of the conference with the attentive patience of someone who has just been the most important person in a room and has smoothly transitioned back to being a regular person without making it a thing. Nathan watched the rest of the conference with the slightly dazed quality of a man who had lived a very full 4 months and was only now beginning to take inventory of what all of it had cost and what it had produced. The drive home that evening was quiet. Owen fell asleep before they reached the freeway, which was not surprising. The particular exhaustion of intense public experience, the adrenaline spending itself all at once. He was out completely, head tilted, the crystal award held loosely in his lap with both hands even in sleep, the way young children hold important things. Nathan drove through the dark November city and let the quiet be what it was. He thought about the day the Holbrook merger closed formally, 2 weeks after the conference. He'd gotten a text from Marcus that said, "Simply done," and he'd been in the middle of reviewing a security architecture proposal when it arrived, and he'd sat with it for a moment, the text and the word and everything the word contained, and then gone back to the proposal. Some things resolved themselves into ordinary life without ceremony, and that was fine. That was how most things resolved. He thought about Raymond Gould, who had been arrested 8 days after the forensic investigation concluded and was currently awaiting trial on charges of corporate espionage and computer fraud. Nathan had given a deposition. It had taken 3 hours and had been handled by a federal prosecutor named Jensen, who was methodical and thorough, and who had, at the end of the 3 hours, thanked Nathan for his cooperation in the flat professional tone of someone who thanks people for their cooperation several times a week. Nathan had driven home from the deposition and picked Owen up from Sandra Kowalski's and made pasta for dinner and helped Owen with a book report on a novel about a boy who builds a raft. And that evening had felt, in its ordinary, competent domesticity, like the most restorative thing that had happened to him in months. He parked in the garage. He gently woke Owen, who surfaced slowly and then gripped the award with renewed purpose. They rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, Owen leaning slightly against Nathan's arm, still mostly asleep. Nathan unlocked the apartment. The familiar smell of it. A smell he'd never consciously registered until he'd been away from it on bad days and come back, met them at the door. Owen went directly to his room to consider the desk arrangement. Nathan put the kettle on. He stood at the kitchen counter while the water heated and looked at the table. The framed photo was still there. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention he'd been giving it lately. Not avoidance, not the full weight of grief, but something more like acknowledgement, a regular, practiced acknowledgement of what was true. He heard Owen's voice from the bedroom. "Dad, come look." He went down the hall and stood in Owen's doorway. Owen had moved things. The circuit board was on the windowsill. The rock collection had been consolidated to one corner. The photograph of Remy had been shifted slightly left. And in the center of the desk, given more room than anything else, was the Crystal Award. Owen had positioned it so the light from his desk lamp hit it at an angle that caught and scattered, small bright points moving across the wall and ceiling. Owen was standing back, assessing. "Good?" Nathan asked. "Good," Owen said. He looked at the scattered light on the ceiling. "It does that thing where it makes little rainbows." "Yeah. I didn't know it would do that." "That's what crystal does." Owen sat on the edge of his bed and looked at it for a moment. "The boy who saved us," he said, reading the engraving out loud, not to Nathan, but to himself, testing how it sounded from inside his own voice. Nathan leaned against the doorframe. "Does it feel weird?" Nathan asked. "Reading that about yourself?" Owen thought about it honestly. "A little. It feels like it's about someone else, and also about me." He paused. "Is that weird?" "No, that's how it works, I think. When something big happens to you, and then it becomes a story about you. The story and the real thing are a little different." Owen considered this. The real thing was just drawing on a napkin. The real thing was paying attention for 8 years and drawing on a napkin. Owen looked at him. "You paid attention, too." "I had a good teacher," Nathan said. Owen's ears went red. He looked at his hands, which were in his lap and were fine. Then he lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling where the award was scattering its fractured light. "Dad?" "Yeah. I want to learn more about it. The systems stuff. Like actually learn it, not just watch." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You're 8. Almost 9. Almost 9, Nathan agreed. "Ms. Hart said at the museum, you told me she asked if I was interested in technology specifically or just generally. What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know yet, that it was your question to answer." Owen nodded at the ceiling. "I think specifically," he said. "I think it's specifically the system stuff. The connections telling the truth thing." He paused. "I want to understand how you know when they're not." Nathan stood in the doorway of his son's room, in the apartment on the 4th floor of a building where one elevator worked 60% of the time, in the November dark with the city's quiet sounds coming through the window, and looked at his almost 9-year-old son lying on his bed, watching refracted light move across the ceiling while deciding what kind of person he was going to be. "We'll figure it out," Nathan said. "Like a class? Or a book? Or what?" "We'll figure it out," he said again. "There's no rush." Owen seemed satisfied with this. He rolled onto his side and looked at the award on the desk. "Good night, Dad." "Good night." Nathan pulled the door halfway closed. The specific degree of halfway that Owen had required since he was 4. Not all the way, not open, exactly that configuration. And went back to the kitchen where the kettle had boiled and was sitting patient and quiet on the counter. He made his tea. He sat at the table. He reached into his jacket, the one hanging on the back of the chair, the same jacket he'd worn on that Tuesday 3 months ago, and found what he'd somehow known was still there. The napkin from Henley's. It had been through the wash once, by accident, and the pencil lines had faded to ghosts of themselves, pale gray suggestions of the shapes Owen had drawn. You could still see the circled pattern at the center. Just barely. Enough. Nathan smoothed it on the table. He sat there looking at it for a while. Not dramatically, not with the weight of revelation. Just looking at it the way you look at a thing that has become an artifact of something real, something that happened, fully and specifically and with consequences, and is now behind you in the way that only the past can be behind you. Not gone, just finished, its work complete. He folded it carefully along the old crease lines and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept the things that didn't have a category. The extra batteries and the takeout menus and the birthday card Owen had made him last year with the drawing of the two of them that looked nothing like them and that he kept anyway. He drank his tea. Outside, November rain started again. He heard it first on the window above the sink, that first few seconds of irregular drops before the steady rhythm established itself. He listened to it come in. He thought about the year. Not the dramatic version of it, the breach and the boardroom and the napkin, but the full version. The 647 alarms, the good eggs, the state capitol's flashcards, the science museum and the circuit board, and the book report on the boy who built a raft, the deposition and the forensic meetings, and the new nameplate on the new office door that had been slightly crooked and that he'd never straightened. He thought about Priya and David and Sheila and Marcus, who were in his professional life in a different and more genuine way than they'd been before October. He thought about Sandra Kowalski on the second floor, who had texted him 3 times since the conference. Once with a news article that had mentioned Viridian, once with a photo she'd taken of Owen sleeping with his award on the couch during an afternoon she'd been watching him, and once just to say she was proud of both of them, which had landed harder than Nathan expected, and which he'd responded to with a thank you that felt inadequate but was the best he could do. He thought about Isabel. The past 3 months had been, among other things, the process of watching someone do a hard thing imperfectly and keep doing it anyway. She'd implemented the new policies, the childcare assistance, the flexible scheduling, the emergency family protocols, and they'd gone into effect in October and had produced by November a series of small, specific changes in the texture of daily life at Viridian that weren't dramatic but were real. A junior engineer on Sheila's team had been able to work remotely for 3 weeks when her father had a medical crisis. A project manager had restructured his schedule around his daughter's therapy appointments without having to file a formal accommodation request or explain himself to anyone. 2 people Nathan knew of had used the emergency childcare subsidy program for exactly the kind of situation he'd been in on that Tuesday in October. None of this resolved the larger question of what kind of leader Isabel Hart was becoming, because that question didn't resolve on a 4-month timeline. People don't change in 4 months. What they do sometimes is start, and the starting is real even when what comes after is still uncertain. Nathan was watching her start. He'd made his assessment provisional and was updating it with new evidence, which was the only honest way to assess anyone. What he'd decided after 3 months of provisional assessment was this: she was genuinely trying. Not performing trying, actually doing it, with the specific discomfort and occasional backsliding of actual effort. She'd overridden a senior manager's performance review process twice in October when it veered into the kind of public blame assignment she'd committed herself to moving away from. She'd been wrong about a technical decision in the new architecture roadmap and had said so in a team meeting without softening it into a collaborative misunderstanding. Small things, but the accumulation of small things was what character was made of. She'd also stopped by his office 3 more times in 3 months without a technical pretext, and each time they'd talked for longer than the visit required, and the conversations had been different from the ones they'd had before October. More horizontal, less transactional, 2 people finding their way towards something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite just professional respect, but was somewhere between, in the territory that exists when people have been through something hard together and can't go back to treating each other like strangers. She'd asked him once, in one of those visits, whether Owen had decided what he wanted to learn next. Nathan had told her about the systems conversation, the ceiling light, and the connections telling the truth thing. She'd been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, "When he's ready, if he's interested, I'd like to have him come in and see the operations center. Not a tour. Actually see how it works, if you both want." Nathan had said he'd ask Owen. Owen had said yes before Nathan finished the sentence. The visit hadn't happened yet. It was on the calendar for December, a Saturday morning, low-key, just the 2 of them and Isabel, and whoever on the technical staff volunteered to walk a 9-year-old through the live systems. Sheila had already volunteered. David had already volunteered. Priya had sent an email that said, "Obviously I'm coming," without being asked. Nathan thought about that December morning. He thought about Owen in the operations center, standing in front of the monitors that had been throwing red and amber alerts on the morning he'd drawn a pattern on a napkin, watching them run calm and green, understanding a little more of the language of what his father did. He thought about what it meant to raise a person, not the abstract version, not the philosophical statement about legacy and influence, but the daily, grinding, insufficient, surprisingly profound version. The version that happened over good eggs and state capitals, flashcards, and half-watched science museum exhibits, and conversations at the kitchen table that you didn't know were important until they turned out to be. He'd been doing it alone for 2 years, and he'd been doing it imperfectly the whole time. He He still forgot things. He still had the 6:47 alarm mornings where the weight of everything sat on his chest before he even reached the kitchen. He still sometimes stood at the counter making coffee and felt the specific dimension shape of Claire's absence in the room, not as devastation anymore, but as a permanent fact of the architecture, load-bearing, unreplaceable. He had not figured out how to be a single father. He had figured out how to be this specific father to this specific boy on these specific ordinary days, and those were not the same thing, and the difference mattered. Owen had not needed a perfect father. He'd needed a present one, a father who answered the questions about why the lines go red, who made the good eggs, who said I don't know yet instead of I'm fine when the honest answer was I don't know yet. A father who picked up a napkin from a diner table and understood what was on it, because he'd spent 2 years at the kitchen table explaining things to a child who was paying full attention. Nathan thought, we saved each other. He thought it plainly, without drama. It was just true. The saving had been mutual and ongoing and mostly invisible and completely ordinary, which was how saving usually worked when it was real. He finished his tea. He rinsed the mug. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked the door, locked, and the windows, closed against the rain, and walked down the hall past Owen's room where the door was half open and where, if he listened, he could hear the slow, steady breathing of a child completely and trustingly asleep. He stood there for a second. The refracted light from the crystal award was still moving very slightly on the ceiling of Owen's room. The wind through the building, or some vibration from the street, keeping it just barely alive. Small, bright points drifting. He watched it for a moment. Then he went to bed. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in the first week of December, the three of them stood in the Viridian Operations Center. The room looked different on a quiet Saturday. The weekday energy, the overlapping urgency of a live operations floor, had settled into something calmer, a skeleton crew running routine monitoring while the city went about its Saturday business outside. The monitors still showed their live feeds, but the feeds were green and stable, information flowing through the system the way information was supposed to flow, truthfully, cleanly, without interference. Owen stood in front of the main monitor wall. He had his hands in his pockets, which was where they'd ended up, and it was fine. He was looking at the screens with the same focused, unhurried attention he'd given the signal propagation display at the Science Museum, not trying to understand everything, just letting what he could understand settle into place. Sheila was explaining the architecture to him. She'd brought a whiteboard marker and was drawing diagrams on a portable whiteboard she'd pulled in from the conference room, and she was talking to Owen the way Nathan had always talked to him. Simplified but not dumbed down, expecting genuine engagement. Owen was asking questions, good ones. Sheila was answering them with the particular energy of an engineer who has been asked a genuinely interesting question by someone paying full attention. David was at a nearby workstation, ostensibly reviewing routine logs, actually listening to the whole conversation with the expression of a man who is enjoying himself more than he's letting on. Priya was doing what Priya did, standing slightly to one side with her clipboard, present without inserting herself, the observational role she'd occupied in every important room Nathan had seen her in. Isabel was standing next to Nathan. They were watching Owen and Sheila, not talking, the quiet kind of side-by-side that two people do when they don't need to fill the space with words, because the thing in front of them is sufficient. After a while, Isabel said quietly, "He's going to be very good at this." "He's going to be good at whatever he decides to be good at," Nathan said. She nodded. "Is that a thing you know, or a thing you believe?" "Both," he said. "They're different muscles." She looked at him. He was looking at Owen. She recognized the phrase, Owen's phrase, from the dinner table story Nathan had told her in the Thursday afternoon office visit. The conversation about wanting and deciding. The way it moved through this family, the phrases and the ideas passed and returned. "His teacher says that," she said. "That one he says is his," Nathan said. Nathan. Isabel stood with that for a moment. Then she said, without looking away from the room, "I've been thinking about the spring program, the family support initiatives." She paused. "I want to add something, a mentorship component, not just support for employees who are parents, but actual investment in the kids. Curriculum development, access to the technical teams, a junior engineering track for older kids." Nathan looked at her. That's a significant expansion. I know. It's going to cost something. She paused. I want to build something that lasts, not a PR response to a specific incident, something structural. She glanced at him sideways. I'd want your involvement in the design of it. That's not in my job description. I know. She let that sit for a moment. I'm asking anyway. Nathan looked at Owen. He was asking Sheila about the authentication layer, the specific section of the architecture where the dormancy trigger had been hiding 3 months ago, now clean and properly monitored. Sheila was explaining it with a diagram. Owen was nodding, following, his brow slightly furrowed in the way it got when something was almost clear and he was working the last piece into place. Nathan thought about what it meant to build something structural, not in the abstract, in the specific. What it took and what it cost, and whether the person proposing it understood the difference between building something because it looked good and building something because it needed to exist. He'd been watching Isabel for 3 months. He'd been updating his assessment. I'm in, he said. She nodded. No performance of relief, no excess of gratitude. Just the nod of someone who'd asked a real question and gotten a real answer. Owen turned around from the whiteboard. Dad, he said, can you explain the authentication part? Sheila explained it, but I want to hear your version too. The 2 versions might be different in useful ways. Nathan looked at him. Did you just say the 2 versions might be different in useful ways? Owen shrugged. That's how you learn things. Multiple sources. Who taught you that? You. Last year. About something else. He tilted his head. Can you explain it or not? Nathan crossed to the whiteboard. He took the marker from Sheila, who gave it up with the slightly amused expression of someone watching a familiar thing happen. He looked at the diagram she'd drawn and added to it. A different angle on the same structure, the way you walk around something to understand it from all sides. Owen watched. He asked 2 questions. Nathan answered both. Owen asked a follow-up that was sharper than the first 2, and Nathan answered that one more carefully because it was a good question and good questions deserved careful answers. Priya watched from the side. David had stopped pretending to look at his logs. Isabel stood at the edge of the room and watched Nathan Reed explain network authentication to his almost 9-year-old son on a Saturday morning in the operations center of a company that both of them had, in their different ways, helped to save. She thought about the boardroom in October. She thought about the badge on the table and the hand on the small shoulder and the door closing and the stone in her chest that had not dissolved until she'd called Priya. She thought about 3 rewrites the night before the conference. She thought about crouching down to Owen's level and saying, my hands are fine, not meaning anything about hands at all. She thought about the waiting room in her mother's law firm, the leather chairs and the old magazines and the granola bar from a receptionist who'd gone back to ignoring her, and how she'd learned in that waiting room to be patient and self-sufficient and not a disruption, and how she'd carried that lesson forward for 22 years and built an entire professional identity on it, and how a Tuesday morning in October had shown her, more clearly than anything else in her life, what that lesson had cost her. She thought about what it meant to unlearn something, not to discard it. Self-sufficiency was real, patience was real, managing yourself was real, but to see it more honestly, to understand that the tools you built yourself with are not neutral, that some of them help you climb, and some of them, once you've climbed, start to close you in. She was 30 years old. She had built a lot of things. She was still building. She was also, she thought, beginning to understand the difference between building something to prove you could and building something because it needed to exist. The difference was not always visible from the outside, but it was felt from the inside every day, in every decision, in whether the room you walked into had room for the person behind you. She watched Owen ask his follow-up question. She watched Nathan answer it carefully. She thought, this is what I'm building toward. Not this specific scene. She wasn't sentimental enough to build a company culture around a scene, but the principle underneath it, the one that says the full, complicated, inconvenient humanity of the people who do the work is not a disruption to be managed. It is the work. It is what makes the work real. She'd said it on the stage 3 weeks ago. She was still figuring out how to mean it every day after. That was the honest version of it, not the TED Talk version, not the Forbes profile version, not the board presentation version. The honest version was, you say the right thing on the stage, and then you go back to the ordinary days and you find out again and again, in small decisions and large ones, whether you meant it or whether you were performing meaning it. She intended to mean it. She was under no illusion that intention was enough. Owen finished with the whiteboard and looked at the full diagram, Sheila's version and Nathan's additions, and said, "Okay," in the satisfied tone of someone who has arrived at a thing and knows it. Then he looked at Isabel. "Miss Hart," he said, "can I ask you something?" She crossed to the whiteboard. "Sure." "What was the first thing you built, like professionally, the first real thing?" Isabel looked at him. The question was Owen-shaped, direct, unadorned, actually curious, carrying none of the social calculation that adults usually brought to questions like that. "A risk management protocol," she said, "at a company I worked for before this one, a failing division. I rebuilt the way they assessed risk, and it turned the division around in about a year." What was failing about it before? They were measuring the wrong things. They were looking at the surface indicators and missing the structural problems. Owen considered this, like only looking at the alerts and not at what was causing the alerts. She looked at him. Exactly like that. "So you were doing the same kind of thing, finding what was actually wrong instead of just what looked wrong." That's one way to put it. Owen nodded. He looked at the monitor wall for a moment, at the green and steady feeds. "I think that's the job," he said. "The real version of it, not just security, lots of jobs. Finding what's actually wrong instead of what looks wrong." The room was quiet for a moment. Nathan was looking at his son with the expression that Priya had been quietly observing for 3 months. The one that was too complicated to name simply, that contained things that were true about fatherhood and loss and the specific astonishment of watching a person become themselves. "Yeah," Nathan said. "I think you're right." Owen looked back at the whiteboard. "Okay, he said. "What's the next part?" And Sheila picked up the marker, and they kept going. The city outside ran its Saturday business. Rain moved through on its way somewhere else and left the streets clean and wet and reflecting the gray December light in a way that turned ordinary concrete into something that looked, briefly, like water. Nathan drove them home at noon. Owen fell asleep 10 minutes into the drive, the award propped against the window beside him, the faces of important things carrying him through the ordinary streets. Nathan drove through the familiar routes, Morrison, the bridge, the turn on Burnside, the right on 14th. He drove through the city that had been his city for 6 years, that had been his and Claire's, and then his and Owen's, that had held them through the worst year, and the year after, and this year, this particular, improbable, difficult, full year. He thought about what Owen had said in the operations center, finding what's actually wrong instead of what looks wrong. He thought about the hook in the scan subroutine. He thought about the waiting room in a law firm and a granola bar from a receptionist who went back to ignoring a little girl. He thought about a recovery system that was built to fix things and had been made, through careful exploitation, to do the opposite. He thought about all the ways people build systems around themselves, for protection, for efficiency, for the appearance of control, and how the most dangerous failures are the ones that look like they're working. The badge going down on the table, the stone that didn't dissolve, the 3 rewrites, the hands that were fine. None of them had come through this year unchanged. That was the honest version. Nathan was not who he'd been in September. Not worse, not better in any simple way, but adjusted, recalibrated, carrying a different set of knowns than the ones he'd started with. Isabel was not who she'd been in October. Owen was, in the way children are, both exactly himself and quietly more, each month adding something to the architecture of who he was becoming. People don't transform. That was the sentimental version of this kind of story, and Nathan had never been built for the sentimental version. People don't transform in a single event, a single revelation, a single standing ovation in a convention hall. They accumulate. They adjust. They take the hard thing that happened and they put it in the drawer with the extra batteries and the takeout menus, alongside all the other hard things that have been processed and filed, and they wake up the next morning and make coffee and get on with it. What changes is smaller and more durable than transformation. What changes is the quality of attention you bring to the ordinary days, the willingness to look at what's actually there instead of what looks like what's there. The decision, made again and again, not once, to be present in the room you're actually in. Nathan had been making that decision for 2 years. He'd been bad at it sometimes. He'd gotten better. He intended to keep getting better in the incremental, non-dramatic way that actually getting better works. He pulled into the parking garage. He turned off the car. He sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to Owen breathe in the back seat. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the parking garage, at the low concrete and the fluorescent tubes, at the completely ordinary ceiling of a completely ordinary structure in a city that was doing its ordinary things, and he thought about what it meant to be here. Specifically, here, in this car, in this garage, with this child asleep in the back seat, and this job, and this life, and this collection of things that were hard and true and his. It wasn't a perfect life. It was an actual one. He got out of the car. He went around to the back door and opened it gently. Owen stirred, but didn't wake. Nathan unclipped his seatbelt carefully and lifted him. He was getting heavy, almost 9. This was going to stop being possible before long, and carried him toward the elevator. Owen's head rested on Nathan's shoulder. The award was still in the back seat. Nathan would go back for it. The elevator was working today. It opened immediately when he pressed the button, which happened maybe 60% of the time, and Nathan noted this small, stupid piece of luck with the specific gratitude of a person who has learned to notice small, stupid pieces of luck because they add up. He carried his son up to the 4th floor, down the mustard carpet hallway, into the apartment that smelled like home. He laid Owen on his bed, still in his jacket, and pulled the blanket over him. Owen made the small sound, complaint and contentment at once, and settled. Nathan stood in the doorway. The Crystal Award was in the car. He'd get it in a minute. He looked at his son sleeping, at the room with the desk arrangement that Owen had decided on, and the rocks in the corner, and Remy's photograph and the scattered light that wasn't there right now because the lamp was off, but would be there tonight when the lamp was on, those small bright points moving across the ceiling. The refracted evidence of a thing that had happened and been named and placed at the center of a cleared space on an 8-year-old's desk because it was important and deserved that room. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went to get the award.